In the vast expanse of the ancient Greek pantheon, there stands a figure whose very name is synonymous with the chaos and power of war. Ares, the god of battle, the embodiment of violence and conflict, occupies a place both revered and feared. As one of the 12 Olympians, Ares' presence in myth is as striking as the clash of arms he represents. Yet, behind the fierce battles and the bloodshed lies a divine figure whose story is one of paradoxes, worshipped by warriors, yet often despised by the gods themselves. In this journey through Ares' myth, we will explore the many facets of his life. His birth from the mighty Zeus and the wise Hera, his complex relationships with gods and mortals alike, and his place in the world of warfare, conflict, and heroism. Through this tale, we will uncover the essence of Ares, not merely as a god of violence, but as a symbol of the unrelenting force of war itself, eternal in its nature and impact. As we begin this exploration of Ares, I invite you to settle in, let your thoughts ease, and drift with the rhythm of his myth, where each moment, though filled with the fury of battle, moves gently toward understanding. If you find comfort in these stories, please like, subscribe, and share where you are watching from as we begin this peaceful journey through the divine battles and legacies of Ares, the god of war. In the timeless realm of the gods where the heavens met the earth, Ares emerged, a figure destined to personify the harsh and uncontrollable forces of war. His birth was not one of joy or celebration, but one marked by the cold inevitability of conflict. Born to Zeus, the king of the gods, and Hera, his powerful and sometimes vengeful queen, Ares' very existence carried the weight of divine complexity. The story of his birth is often told with little fanfare, a stark contrast to the god of war's later presence in the annals of myth. Zeus, the ruler of Mount Olympus, had many children by many wives. Yet, Ares stood apart from many of his siblings, for he was the embodiment of one of the most intense aspects of existence, war. While other gods represented more serene elements of life, wisdom, love, or harvest, Ares was a god of chaos, strife, and the brutal force of battle. His mother, Hera, was no stranger to conflict herself, for she often found herself in opposition to the actions of her husband, Zeus. Yet, despite the often turbulent nature of their marriage, Ares was a product of their union, a child whose very essence would forever be tied to the violent heart of the world. From the moment of his birth, Ares was imbued with the power of war. Unlike his siblings, who found their purpose in other domains, Ares' path seemed clear. He was destined to be a force of nature, as necessary to the world as the sun's rise or the moon's pale glow. His role, though feared, was one that even the gods could not ignore. In the deep shadows of Olympus, where divine plots and intrigues were woven daily, Ares grew, slowly, silently at first, yet with a relentless force that mirrored the wars he would one day wage. Some myths say that Ares was not easily embraced by all the gods. Hera, his mother, while the goddess of marriage and family, had a distant relationship with her son. There was a coldness to her affection for Ares that many felt, even in their immortal realm. In some stories, Hera is said to have resented the nature of Ares, seeing him as a reminder of the violent world over which she had little control. Her love for him, though present, was tainted by the understanding that he was a reflection of the chaos she herself could neither guide nor tame. Despite this, Ares was raised among the other gods, but he was never fully accepted. The other Olympians, with few exceptions, often viewed Ares with a mixture of disdain and fear. They saw him as a necessary force, but one whose purpose was too often in opposition to the more harmonious aspects of the world. Athena, the goddess of wisdom, represented the strategic side of war, while Ares embodied its raw, unbridled violence. Their relationship was one of contrast. Where Athena was revered for her intellect and foresight, Ares was feared for his unpredictability and rage. It was this difference that marked Ares's place among the gods, both a figure to be respected and a figure to be feared. From his infancy, Ares exhibited a nature far more aggressive than that of his siblings. While his twin sister, Athena, found herself drawn to strategy and wisdom, Ares reveled in the raw energy of physical conflict. His presence was often unsettling, his demeanor restless. He would spend his time in the training grounds, wielding weapons and preparing for battle, even though no war had yet been declared. As the seasons changed, so too did Ares's resolve, and with each passing year, his reputation began to grow, not just as the son of Zeus, but as a divine entity who would one day leave an indelible mark upon the world. The legends of Ares's early years are few, but they do hint at his growth into a force that would one day be called upon in the most momentous of conflicts. As he matured, Ares became known for his strength and aggression, traits that made him both revered and despised. His stature grew, as did his fearsome reputation. Yet, despite his burgeoning power, Ares' relationship with his family remained strained. His father, Zeus, was often distant, preoccupied with the weight of ruling the heavens and the earth. In this sense, Ares seemed to be left to forge his own destiny, often battling not only the enemies of Olympus, but also the internal struggles of living in a world defined by conflict. Yet, while Ares' birth and youth were marked by conflict, they were also marked by the stillness that comes with being born into a world where one's fate is preordained. As the god of war, Ares would soon be called upon to fulfill his destiny in ways that were both tragic and necessary. For it was in the battles that would follow, those monumental clashes between gods, mortals, and titans, that Ares would begin to show the world just what it meant to be born under the sign of violence. But for now, in the quiet halls of Olympus, Ares existed as a figure of potential, waiting, as all gods do, for the moment when his true purpose would be revealed. As his birth faded into the distant past, Ares continued to grow, his presence becoming more pronounced in the divine realm. His role was clear. He was the god of war, and in that capacity he would remain, a symbol of the ferocity and passion of battle. Yet, as with all gods, the true weight of Ares' existence could not be understood until the day came when he would take his place on the front lines of the greatest wars to ever shape the world. Ares' life was never one of solitude. Raised in the vast halls of Mount Olympus, he was surrounded by his divine family, gods and goddesses of immeasurable power and wisdom. Though he was often an outlier among his siblings, marked by the raw chaotic energy of war, the interactions and relationships he had with them played a significant role in shaping the god he would become. For in the world of the gods, family bonds were not merely domestic. They were cosmic in their reach, influencing the very fabric of divine order. Ares' siblings were not simply companions. They were part of a larger, intricate web of power and purpose. Among these siblings, Athena, Apollo, Artemis, Hermes, and others stood as figures of exceptional influence, each embodying an aspect of life that was distinct from Ari's own. Yet, despite their differences, they were all bound by the same divine blood, each struggling to find their place in the cosmic order. The first of Ari's siblings to be considered is Athena, his older sister by birth, and perhaps the one with whom he had the most complicated relationship. Athena, goddess of wisdom and strategy, was the polar opposite of Ares. Where Ares revelled in the ferocity of battle, Athena found her strength in intelligence, foresight, and the strategic elements of war. She was often portrayed as calm, composed, and driven by reason, while Ares embodied the untamed passion of the battlefield. To many, Athena's grace and intellect made her the ideal figure of warfare, while Ares, in contrast, was seen as the embodiment of its most brutal and uncontrollable aspects. Despite their differences, Ares and Athena were not adversaries in the traditional sense, though their conflicting methods often put them at odds. Their interactions were not defined by enmity, but rather by a sense of divergence, a natural tension between the strategic and the primal. Ares' approach to war was one of instinct, fighting for the sake of chaos and domination, while Athena's guidance was sought in times of need for calculated victory. In some versions of myth, the two gods were even seen on opposite sides of the battlefield, with Athena representing the forces of discipline and Ares leading the charge of disorder. Yet, there was an underlying respect between them, as each understood the role the other played in the grand scheme of things. Ares' relationship with Apollo and Artemis, the twin children of Zeus and Leto, was less pronounced, but no less significant. Apollo, the god of light, music, and prophecy, was another embodiment of order, calm, harmonious, and a figure who was revered not only for his skills in archery, but also for his influence in shaping the fates of mortals and gods alike. Artemis, his twin sister, was the goddess of the hunt, known for her independence, strength, and the fierce protection she offered to nature and animals. In many respects, Ares' connection with Apollo and Artemis was distant. The three gods did not share the same domain, and while they would occasionally meet on the fields of battle or in the councils of Olympus, their interactions were often characterized by mutual recognition rather than affection. Apollo's celestial wisdom and Artemis's wild, untamable nature were both so different from Ares' own domain that it was difficult for them to understand each other fully. Yet, this distance did not breed contempt. Instead, it simply added to the complexity of Ares' place in the family, sometimes isolated, but always aware of the roles his siblings played. Another sibling of Ares was Hermes, the god of travelers, trade, and thieves, known for his cunning, speed, and wit. Unlike the others, Hermes was more mischievous and far more adaptable in his ways. Where Ares was defined by his immovable nature as a god of war, Hermes was ever-changing, his wit and agility allowing him to navigate both the heavens and the earth with ease. Ares and Hermes, while sharing a mutual respect, were often seen in different circles, Ares in the heat of battle and Hermes among the tricksters and those who lived by their wits. Yet, as with the others, Hermes' cleverness and resourcefulness were not lost on Ares. In some accounts, the two gods even found themselves allies in certain endeavors, with Hermes offering his quick wit and Ares his unyielding strength. It was said that when Ares' blunt force was needed, Hermes' subtlety could often turn the tide, and in return, Ares would provide the muscle for Hermes' more intellectual schemes. Of course, the family dynamics of the gods were never simple. While Ares and his siblings were united by their divine parentage, the relationships they shared were marked by differences in temperament, purpose, and influence. Their interactions were not shaped by the closeness that often defines mortal families, but rather by a shared understanding of their roles in the cosmos. Each god and goddess had their own path to follow, and Ares was one of direct action, violence, and chaos, a path that often left him standing apart from his more measured siblings. Yet, Ares did not lack for companionship. His bond with Return, his father, Zeus, was complicated, as Ares was often seen as a reminder of the harsh and unpredictable nature of the world. Zeus, though a god of immense power, was often distant in his relationship with Ares, as he was with many of his children. Still, there were moments when father and son would find themselves on the same side, such as in the battles of the gods, where Ares would fight for Zeus's cause. These moments, while infrequent, spoke to the deeper ties that bound them, not just as father and son, but as gods of great importance in the workings of the universe. The family of Ares was marked not by harmony, but by balance. Each god and goddess played a part in the grand narrative of existence, contributing to the ebb and flow of the divine world. For Ares, his siblings represented the various forces that shaped the world, forces of wisdom, light, and cunning. Ares himself, however, stood as a force of pure, unrestrained power, destined to be the catalyst for conflict and destruction. He did not always find companionship among his family, but he was never alone. In his role as the god of war, Ares would forever be entwined in the tapestry of Olympus, where his family, though different from him, remained ever present, their actions forever linked to his own. In this way, Ares was shaped not just by his own power, but by the divine forces surrounding him, each sibling contributing in their own way to the god Ares would become. They were all part of the great cosmic dance, a dance in which each played their part, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in opposition, but always intertwined in the eternal cycle of creation and destruction. Ares, the god of war, stands as one of the most complex and enigmatic figures within the vast pantheon of Greek deities. Unlike Athena, his sister who embodies the strategic and rational aspects of battle, Ares represents the raw, unrestrained power of conflict. His essence is not rooted in the art of war's tactics or wisdom, but rather in its violent and chaotic nature. He is the embodiment of destruction, a force that can ravage and reshape the world, a presence that stirs both reverence and fear in the hearts of gods and mortals alike. From the moment of his birth, Ares was marked by this singular purpose: to personify war in all its devastating forms. While many of the other Olympian gods governed aspects of life that promoted growth, peace, or knowledge, Ares was the eternal reminder of the darkness that accompanies battle, the bloodshed, the loss, the madness of conflict. His role was not to end wars or resolve them, as Athena might. Rather, he thrived in the heart of battle, feeding off the violence, the cries of the fallen, and the ever-present tension of impending destruction. In the halls of Olympus, Ares' identity as a god of war was established early. Unlike his siblings, who often walked among mortals or intervened in matters of diplomacy and justice, Ares' domain was more primal and untamed. His presence was felt not in the peaceful moments between conflicts, but in the very midst of battle, the clash of shields, the roar of warriors, the thrill of the fight. He was not a god to be reasoned with or appeased, but one whose nature was fierce, impulsive, and relentless. It was in the battlefields of the ancient world, both mythical and historical, that Ares came to embody the very spirit of war. His was not a passive form of warfare, one driven by reason or noble causes, but a chaotic, all-consuming force. In the myths, Ares often appears as a god who delights in the strife of conflict, his presence bringing fear to both mortals and immortals alike. He's not a strategist like Athena, nor a hero like Heracles. Instead, Ares is the force that drives men to fight, to conquer, and to destroy. His influence in battle is not subtle, but overwhelming, like the sheer weight of a tempest or the crushing blow of an earthquake. Many of the myths surrounding Ares emphasize his willingness to engage in war without hesitation or remorse. He did not fight for glory or honor, nor did he fight for the ideals of justice or freedom. Instead, Ares fought for the sheer thrill of battle, for the catharsis that only combat could provide. His actions were not always tied to morality or purpose. They were driven by the primal instinct to destroy and conquer. In this sense, Ares was both a god and a force of nature, untamable, unpredictable, and all-encompassing. One of the most vivid depictions of Ares in battle comes from his role in the Trojan War, where he was both an active participant and a symbol of the chaos that defined the conflict. Ares fought on both sides of the war, shifting allegiances with little regard for the causes of the fighting. In one myth, Ares is depicted as charging into battle alongside the Trojans, his presence on the battlefield sending a wave of fear through the Greek forces. Yet, in another version of the story, he is found fighting for the Greeks, just as willing to spill blood on one side as he was on the other. This lack of allegiance is telling. It is not the outcome of the war that matters to Ares, but the war itself, the endless cycle of violence that defines his existence. Throughout the conflict, Ares is portrayed as a god whose very nature is intertwined with the madness of war. He relishes in the destruction, feeding off the chaos and embracing the bloodshed with a kind of fervor that is unsettling. Yet, despite his violent nature, Ares was not invincible. In some stories, he is injured on the battlefield, his wounds symbolizing the vulnerability of even the most powerful gods when caught in the fury of conflict. This vulnerability does not diminish his power, but rather underscores the inevitability of violence, a force that can wound even those who embody it. Ares' role in the Trojan War, however, was not entirely negative in the eyes of the Greeks. While he represented the chaos and destruction of war, he was also seen as a necessary force. In the ancient world, warfare was an inevitable part of life, and Ares was both a god to be feared and one to be respected. To be a warrior was to honor Ares, for he was the one who would lend strength and courage in battle. His followers, those who lived by the sword, worshipped him, seeking his favor before heading into combat. His temples were erected throughout Greece, and sacrifices were made in his name, asking for his blessings in battle. But despite the devotion of his followers, Ares was often at odds with other gods. Athena, his sister, who represented the more noble aspects of warfare, would frequently criticize Ares for his reckless, destructive nature. She embodied the strategy and intellect that could end wars swiftly and honorably, whereas Ares thrived on the bloodshed and suffering that came with prolonged conflict. Their rivalry was symbolic of the broader conflict between the disciplined, calculated aspects of war and the unrestrained violence that Ares embodied. The gods themselves often viewed Ares with a mixture of disdain and fear. While some, like Apollo and Artemis, saw him as a necessary evil, others, such as Hera and Zeus, were less inclined to embrace his chaotic nature. Ares was, after all, the personification of all that was uncontrollable and dangerous in war. The unpredictability of the battlefield, the madness that overtakes men in the heat of conflict, and the destruction that follows in war's wake. Even in his relationships with mortals, Ares's role as a god of war was evident. He was not a protector or a guardian, like Zeus or Apollo, but a force that could inspire both bravery and terror. In many of the myths, mortals who worshipped Ares were often warriors themselves, seeking his favor before they embarked on their campaigns. His influence over the course of their battles was undeniable. His presence on the battlefield could turn the tide of war, for better or worse. Yet, Ares did not care for the mortal lives caught in his wake. He was not interested in the political or moral implications of the wars he waged. His purpose was simply to fuel the fires of conflict, regardless of who the victors might be. Through all of this, Ares remained, in the eyes of the ancient Greeks, a symbol of the unrelenting force of war. He was not a god of peace or reconciliation, but one who embodied the necessity of conflict, the power of violence, and the ever-present reality of battle. His role in the divine world was as important as it was unsettling. A reminder that even in a world populated by gods of wisdom, love, and beauty, the brutal reality of war would always be present. Ares, the god of war, was not born into peace. His very existence, from the moment of his birth, was a declaration of the chaos and violence that would define his role in the divine world. As a young god, Ares' early experiences with battle were formative, shaping him into the fearsome figure he would later become. From these early engagements, he began to develop a reputation as a deity who thrived in conflict, relentless, powerful, and deeply attuned to the instincts of war. In the myths, Ares is often portrayed as a god who was ever ready to engage in battle, his fierce nature driving him into the heart of conflict whenever and wherever it arose. Unlike his more strategic sister, Athena, who represented the calculated and intellectual aspects of war, Ares was drawn to the primal, untamed side of battle. He was the embodiment of the chaos, rage, and bloodshed that accompanied the clash of armies, the screams of warriors, and the desperation of combat. One of the first and most significant of Ares's early battles took place during the tumultuous period of the Gigantomachy, the war between the Olympian gods and the giants. The battle between these two opposing forces was a cataclysmic event, one that would forever alter the balance of power in the cosmos. For Ares, the Gigantomachy was not merely a battle to defend the gods, but an opportunity to prove his worth as a warrior and as a god of war. His participation in the conflict was marked by his brutal fighting style, his wild and uncontrolled fury. Where Athena fought with wisdom and strategy, Ares fought with abandon, his very presence on the battlefield a reminder of the sheer force of violence. Though the giants were formidable adversaries, monstrous beings born of the earth, they were no match for the power and rage that Ares brought to the fight. His role in the Gigantomachy was that of a vengeful warrior, attacking the giants with an unrelenting ferocity. His battle was not one of tactics or diplomacy. It was a display of raw strength and divine fury, a violent outpouring that seemed to embody the very nature of war itself. Ares, alongside his fellow gods, was instrumental in the defeat of the giants, though it is worth noting that his role in the battle was often more chaotic than heroic. He did not fight for the preservation of order or peace, but for the simple exhilaration of war. This is the essence of Ares, the god who would fight for the sake of the fight itself, rather than for any higher purpose. After the Gigantomachy, Ares' reputation as a god of violence and conflict continued to grow. His next notable engagement was the Trojan War, one of the most famous and enduring conflicts in Greek mythology. The war itself was a sprawling and multifaceted struggle, involving gods, heroes, and mortals, with each side vying for control and dominance. Ares' role in the Trojan War, like his role in previous battles, was one of chaotic force and destruction. Unlike Athena, who fought for strategy and victory, Ares was drawn to the war for its violence, its bloodshed, and the raw energy that came with it. Ares' presence in the Trojan War was felt on both sides, though he was often portrayed as favoring the Trojans. This was not because he held any particular affection for the city of Troy or its people, but because he found the violence of the conflict to be intoxicating. As the god of war, Ares reveled in the unrestrained nature of the battle, the constant clash of weapons, the fury of the combatants. His participation in the war was not driven by political or personal alliances, but by a deep, almost primal need to be at the center of destruction. His actions on the battlefield were not about achieving a specific goal or outcome, but about immersing himself in the violent spectacle of the war. In several myths, Ares is depicted as charging into battle alongside the Trojans, his presence sending waves of fear through the Greek forces. In others, he is seen fighting against the Trojans, lending his strength to the Greek side. This shifting allegiance is characteristic of Ares' nature. He was not concerned with the outcome of the war or the larger moral implications of the conflict. Instead, he fought because it was his nature to do so. He was the personification of war itself, and in the Trojan War, his participation was a reminder that conflict, in all its forms, was inevitable and relentless. Throughout the Trojan War, Ares engaged in several key confrontations, often joining the fray in a direct and brutal manner. In one notable episode, he is said to have fought against the hero Diomedes, one of the greatest warriors of the Greek forces. Diomedes, with the blessing of Athena, managed to wound Ares, a rare feat for a mortal. The injury that Ares sustained at the hands of Diomedes was symbolic. Though Ares was a god of war, even he was not invulnerable. The wound he received in this battle underscored the chaotic nature of war, in which even the most powerful can be brought low. It was a reminder that war, while fierce and unrelenting, could also be unpredictable and merciless. Despite this injury, Ares continued to fight throughout the war, his resilience mirroring the endurance of war itself. His involvement in the Trojan War was marked by his participation in the most brutal and devastating moments of the conflict. He was a god who did not shy away from battle, but embraced it fully, his very presence fueling the violence that surrounded him. Ares was a god of war, not just because of his strength or his ability to fight, but because he thrived in the chaos and destruction that came with it. As the Trojan War continued, Ares' role as a god of war became more defined. His actions on the battlefield were not driven by a desire for victory or conquest, but by a deeper, more primal impulse to be at the center of conflict, to feed off the violence, and to embody the relentless nature of war itself. This was the essence of Ares, the god who fought not for glory or honor, but for the sheer destructive force of battle. Through his early battles, Ares became more than just a god of war. He became a symbol of the eternal cycle of conflict. His presence on the battlefield, whether in the Gigantomachy or the Trojan War, was a reminder that war, in all its brutality, is an inescapable part of the human and divine condition. Ares, in his very essence, represented the violent forces that drive conflict, and his role in these early battles solidified his place as one of the most important and fearsome gods in Greek mythology. The Trojan War, one of the most significant and enduring events in Greek mythology, would come to define the lives of many gods and mortals alike. It was a conflict that spanned 10 long years and involved the gods themselves, who took sides in the struggle between the city of Troy and the Achaeans. For Ares, the god of war, this was not just a war like any other. It was a defining moment in his existence, a battle that would showcase his raw power, his unpredictability, and his intense connection to the chaotic forces of conflict. Though Ares had participated in numerous skirmishes and battles before the Trojan War, this was his first true, epic conflict, a war on a scale that matched the power he embodied. The war itself was sparked by the abduction of Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world, by Paris, the Prince of Troy. This act of defiance set the stage for a bitter struggle, one that would involve heroes like Achilles, Hector, and Odysseus, as well as gods like Athena, Hera, and, of course, Ares. Ares' involvement in the Trojan War was not one of neutrality. He was a god whose very nature was aligned with the destructive forces of battle, and so it was that he chose sides. Though, as with many of his actions, his alliances were not always clear-cut. Unlike Athena, who fought for the Greeks out of a sense of duty and strategy, Ares' motivations were far more primal. He was not interested in the outcome of the war, nor did he care for the larger political implications of the conflict. Instead, Ares was drawn to the war for the sheer violence of it, the destruction and chaos that it unleashed. Initially, Ares sided with the Trojans. It was not because he had any particular love for the city of Troy or its people, but because he was captivated by the chaos of the battle. The Trojans were fighting for their survival, and their struggle was one that resonated with Ares' very being. As the god of war, he thrived in the heat of battle, feeding off the violence and bloodshed that permeated the conflict. His presence on the battlefield was a symbol of the raw, untamed power of war, and his actions reflected this. Throughout the war, Ares fought on the front lines, engaging in combat with some of the greatest heroes of the age. His role in the conflict was marked by his brutal, unpredictable nature. Unlike the more controlled and strategic battles that Athena might oversee, Ares' approach to war was one of unrelenting aggression. He was the god who embodied the frenzy of battle, the mindless rage that overtakes warriors when they are caught in the grip of violence. Ares fought with the ferocity of a storm, his blows landing like thunder, his presence overwhelming. In several instances during the Trojan War, Ares clashed directly with some of the greatest Greek warriors. One of his most notable confrontations was with Diomedes, the great Greek hero. Diomedes, a fierce and valiant warrior, was granted divine assistance by Athena, who imbued him with extraordinary strength and courage. This allowed Diomedes to face Ares in combat and even wound him, a rare and significant event in the mythological record. The wound that Ares received at Diomedes' hands was not only a physical injury, but a symbolic one. It served as a reminder that even the gods, powerful as they were, could be hurt in the midst of conflict. This moment marked the vulnerability of Ares, who, despite being the embodiment of war, was not invincible. However, Ares' wound did not diminish his power or his resolve. He recovered quickly from the injury and continued to fight on the side of the Trojans. His role in the Trojan War was not limited to a single clash or a single victory. Instead, it was a constant, unrelenting presence on the battlefield. Ares fought alongside the Trojans, his divine power lending strength to their efforts. His presence was felt in the most brutal moments of the war, when the violence and chaos reached their peak. As the war progressed, Ares found himself at the heart of some of its most pivotal moments. One of these moments came when Ares intervened in a fight between Hector, the Trojan prince, and Achilles, the Greek hero. Hector was one of the greatest warriors of the Trojan side, and his death would mark the turning point of the war. Ares, driven by his nature as the god of war, sided with the Trojans, joining the fray on Hector's behalf. Though Achilles was destined to be the hero of the war, Ares' intervention in this moment symbolized the unpredictability and violence that defined the conflict. Ares' actions during the Trojan War were not driven by personal vendettas or desires for glory. He was not a god who fought for honor or recognition. Rather, Ares was driven by the sheer exhilaration of battle itself. His actions were a reflection of his primal nature, his need to be in the thick of conflict, to feel the intensity of war. He did not care for the cause or the outcome. He fought for the sake of the fight, for the destruction and chaos that only war could bring. Despite Ares' fierce involvement in the war, the other gods were not always pleased with his actions. Many of the Olympians, especially Athena and Hera, disapproved of his chaotic and destructive nature. Athena, the goddess of wisdom and strategy, was deeply critical of Ares for his lack of discipline and for the senseless violence he perpetuated. Hera, who often sought to manipulate events from behind the scenes, found Ares' unpredictability to be an inconvenience. Yet, despite these disapproving views, Ares remained steadfast in his commitment to the war. He was not swayed by the criticisms of others, for he was a god who was defined by his role in the battle, not by the opinions of his fellow gods. In the end, the Trojan War would come to an end with the fall of Troy. But Ares' legacy in the conflict was indelible. His presence on the battlefield had been a constant reminder of the primal forces of war, the chaos that always accompanies conflict. While other gods might have fought for noble causes or strategic victories, Ares fought for the sheer violence of it all. He was not a god who sought resolution. He was a god who thrived in the midst of turmoil. The Trojan War was Ares' first major conflict, and it would serve as a defining moment in his existence. Though he was not the hero of the war, nor the one who shaped its outcome, Ares played a crucial role in the violence and destruction that marked the conflict. His presence in the war was a testament to his nature as the god of war, a being who embodied the chaos and bloodshed that are the inevitable consequences of battle. As long as war existed, Ares would be there, fighting for the sake of the fight itself, embodying the dark, relentless forces that drive conflict across the ages. Ares, the god of war, was not only a figure of violence and destruction, but also a lover, one whose passionate affairs became as legendary as his exploits in battle, while his nature as a god of chaos and conflict made him an intimidating and often feared figure. His relationships with various deities and mortals revealed a different, more personal side to his character. Despite the intensity of his role as the god of war, Ares was also a god who experienced the deep, sometimes contradictory forces of love, desire, and attraction. Perhaps the most famous of Ares's romantic entanglements was with Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty. This affair, though brief in some versions of the myth, would go on to become one of the most enduring stories of divine romance in Greek mythology. The very union of Ares and Aphrodite is a striking contrast. He, the god of brutal violence, and she, the goddess of beauty and love. Their relationship, filled with passion and secrecy, was a testament to the complexity of Ares's character. A god who, though defined by war, was also susceptible to the soft allure of love. The myth of Ares and Aphrodite begins with a clandestine love affair, as the two gods, despite their opposing natures, were irresistibly drawn to each other. Aphrodite, whose beauty was said to be so radiant that it could make even the most hardened of hearts soften, found herself captivated by Ares's strength and raw energy. Ares, in turn, was enchanted by Aphrodite's ethereal beauty, and their attraction was immediate. Their love was secret, hidden from the watchful eyes of the other gods, for it was an affair that was not meant to be exposed. However, despite their attempts to keep their love hidden, their affair was soon discovered by none other than Hephaestus, Aphrodite's husband. Hephaestus, the god of blacksmithing and craftsmanship, was not only deeply hurt by the infidelity of his wife, but also enraged by the betrayal. Hephaestus, known for his skill in creating intricate and powerful traps, devised a cunning plan to expose Ares and Aphrodite's affair. He crafted a beautiful, invisible net, one that would ensnare both lovers and reveal their treachery to the gods. When Ares and Aphrodite were caught in the trap, they were publicly humiliated. The other gods of Olympus gathered to witness the scene, laughing at the entangled couple. Yet, despite the shame of the situation, there was a certain sympathy for Ares. He was, after all, a god who represented the violence of war, a figure who was rarely associated with tenderness or affection. To see Ares, the mighty warrior, caught in a moment of vulnerability and love was a surprising and even moving spectacle. In the end, however, Ares was not punished as harshly as one might have expected. His strength and influence among the gods protected him, and the matter was eventually forgotten. Though Ares and Aphrodite's love affair was marred by deception, their connection was undeniable. Some versions of the myth suggest that their love was more than just a fleeting romance. In fact, the union between Ares and Aphrodite resulted in several children, most notably Phobos and Deimos, the personifications of fear and terror. These children, like their father, would come to symbolize the darker aspects of war and conflict, fear and dread in the hearts of warriors and mortals alike. In this way, Ares' relationship with Aphrodite produced offspring who embodied the very essence of their father's influence on the battlefield. Ares' connection with Aphrodite is often seen as one of passion, yet also fraught with the complexities that come with love between two gods who represent opposing forces. While Aphrodite symbolized the harmony and beauty of love, Ares symbolized the violence and turmoil of war. Their relationship, while deeply intense, was not built on the foundation of mutual understanding or peace, but rather on a shared, fiery passion that transcended their differences. But Aphrodite was not the only lover of Ares. The god of war, with his formidable presence and untamed nature, was often the object of desire for other deities and mortal women. His relationships, though sometimes brief or unnoticed in the grander mythological narratives, shed light on his more personal side. His need for connection, for moments of softness amid the violence that defined his existence. One such lover was the goddess Enyo, often referred to as the goddess of war. Enyo, like Ares, was associated with destruction and bloodshed, and her affinity for conflict mirrored his own. In some myths, she is even portrayed as a companion to Ares on the battlefield, sharing his love for the violence and chaos of war. Their relationship was one built on a shared understanding of their divine roles, gods who thrived in battle, whose very existence was tied to the forces of aggression and destruction. Ares' relationships with other mortal women also contributed to his reputation as a lover. In some lesser-known myths, Ares is said to have had affairs with mortals, resulting in children who carried his divine essence. These mortal affairs were often brief, yet they served to deepen Ares' connection with the human world, a world that was, like the gods, deeply affected by the nature of war. The children born from these unions were often warriors or figures associated with conflict, further emphasizing Ares' influence on the mortal realm. Despite the seemingly unrestrained nature of Ares' romantic encounters, there was an underlying consistency in the type of love he sought. Love that was as intense and as raw as the battlefields he frequented. Whether in the arms of Aphrodite, Enyo, or mortal women, Ares sought connection not just for the sake of pleasure, but for the powerful, consuming force that love could bring. His affairs were often driven by the same force that propelled him into battle: passion, desire, and an overwhelming need for intensity. Ares' relationships, like his role in war, were never simple or straightforward. They were filled with complexity, contradiction, and conflict. The god of war was not a deity who could easily be defined by a single characteristic. Whether as a lover or as a warrior, Ares was both powerful and vulnerable, both destructive and tender. His affairs, like his battles, were a reflection of the fierce intensity that ran through his veins. A god who, though defined by chaos, could also be driven by the most human of desires. Among the many divine relationships in Greek mythology, few are as striking or as symbolically rich as the affair between Ares, the god of war, and Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty. Their union, though often tumultuous and filled with contradictions, became one of the most famous in all of myth. It was a love that defied the expectations of the gods and mortals alike, for it was a love born from opposing forces: Ares, the embodiment of war's violent and chaotic nature, and Aphrodite, the personification of beauty, harmony, and love. In this way, their affair is a powerful metaphor for the contradictions that lie at the heart of existence itself: passion, beauty, and destruction, entwined in a bond that could never be easily defined. The beginning of their relationship is often described as one of irresistible attraction. Despite their stark differences, Ares and Aphrodite were drawn to one another in a way that seemed beyond their control. Aphrodite, with her radiant beauty and charm, had the power to captivate the hearts of all who gazed upon her. She was adored not just by mortals, but by gods as well. It is said that her beauty was so great that even Zeus, the king of the gods, could not help but be enamored by her, though he knew she belonged to Hephaestus, her divine husband. Ares, for all his power and might as the god of war, was not immune to the allure of Aphrodite. He was captivated by her ethereal beauty, and she in turn found his strength, his raw energy, and his intensity compelling. Though their nature as gods made their connection seem fated in some ways, their affair was also a reflection of their mutual need for the opposite of what they each embodied. Aphrodite, in her pursuit of love and beauty, found in Ares a kind of passion that was absent from her world of gentleness. Ares, in his embrace of violence and destruction, sought a form of love that was as intense and consuming as the wars he fought in. Their love, though passionate, was not meant to last in the eyes of the gods. Aphrodite was already married to Hephaestus, the god of fire and craftsmanship. Hephaestus, though not as physically imposing as Ares, was a skilled and revered deity, known for his creations of marvelous weapons and treasures. Yet, Hephaestus's own strength was not enough to hold the affection of his wife, for it was the wild, untamable energy of Ares that Aphrodite found irresistible. The gods, ever watchful of the affairs of their peers, soon took notice of the forbidden love between Ares and Aphrodite. Hephaestus, the cuckolded husband, was no fool. He had long suspected that something was amiss between his wife and Ares, for the two had been seen together on several occasions, their chemistry undeniable. In an act of clever vengeance, Hephaestus set a trap for the lovers, one that would expose their affair to all of Olympus. Hephaestus, a god known for his ingenuity and craftsmanship, forged a magical net so fine and so strong that it was virtually invisible to the eye. With this net, he ensnared Ares and Aphrodite while they were together in the act of their passion. When the trap was sprung, the two gods were bound together, unable to free themselves. Hephaestus, now armed with the proof of their infidelity, called upon the other gods to witness the disgrace of Ares and Aphrodite. The gods gathered, and the scene was one of mockery and amusement as they watched the two lovers tangled in Hephaestus's net. In some versions of the myth, Ares and Aphrodite are humiliated by the laughter of the gods. The divine assembly, usually composed of beings who were above the petty squabbles of mortals, found great amusement in the sight of Ares, the mighty god of war, and Aphrodite, the goddess of love, caught in such a compromising position. Yet, despite the mockery, there was a certain sympathy for the lovers. Ares, despite his fearsome nature, was not immune to the same vulnerabilities that mortals face in matters of the heart. The image of Ares, normally so powerful and dominant, being brought low by his feelings for Aphrodite, is one that speaks to the universality of love and desire, even for gods. In the end, however, Ares and Aphrodite were not punished as one might expect. Though their affair was exposed for all to see, the other gods did not mete out severe retribution. Ares, despite his actions, remained a powerful and respected deity, and Aphrodite, despite the scandal, was still the goddess of beauty and love. The episode ended with the two lovers being freed from Hephaestus's net, and their relationship, while marked by shame, continued to exist. The gods' laughter subsided, and the matter was eventually forgotten, as the gods were often wont to do with such trivial matters. The relationship between Ares and Aphrodite produced several children, the most notable of whom were Phobos and Deimos, the personifications of fear and terror. These children, like their parents, became integral to the divine forces of war. Phobos and Deimos, often depicted as accompanying their father into battle, represented the psychological effects of war, fear and terror that paralyzed the hearts of warriors. These children were embodiments of the emotional and mental toll of conflict, showing that Ares's influence extended far beyond the battlefield, reaching into the very minds of those who fought. The love between Ares and Aphrodite was symbolic of the chaotic and unpredictable nature of both war and love. It was an affair that transcended the boundaries of what was expected, just as war itself often transcends reason and order. Ares, the god of destruction, and Aphrodite, the goddess of beauty, found in each other a union of opposites, one that could not be easily understood, yet one that was undeniable in its intensity. Their love was one of contradiction, a reminder that even the most primal and destructive forces could be shaped by tenderness and desire. While the affair of Ares and Aphrodite was often seen as a scandal, it also served to highlight the complexity of their characters. Ares, the god of war, was not just a figure of brute strength and violence. He was also capable of deep, consuming love. Aphrodite, the goddess of love, was not simply a figure of gentleness and grace. She, too, could be driven by passion and desire that defied convention. In their love, Ares and Aphrodite embodied the dualities of life, love and war, beauty and chaos, showing that even in the most sacred and divine of realms, the forces of attraction and passion could be as powerful as the forces of conflict and destruction. Ares, the god of war, is one of the most paradoxical figures in Greek mythology. He is known for his embodiment of violence, bloodshed, and chaos. Yet, beneath the surface of this fierce and unrelenting god, there lies an inherent irony, one that speaks to the contradictions of his very existence. For Ares, as the god of war, was both a symbol of destruction and a necessary force in the divine and mortal realms. He was both revered and reviled, feared and misunderstood, in a way that made him one of the most complex gods in the entire pantheon. From the earliest myths, Ares was depicted as the god who represented the raw, untamable nature of war. Unlike Athena, his sister, who personified the strategic and intellectual aspects of combat, Ares was often shown as impulsive, chaotic, and fueled by rage. He reveled in the violent clash of weapons and the carnage that followed. His presence on the battlefield was marked by a brutal, almost savage force, one that was as destructive to the gods as it was to the mortals who fought in his name. Yet, despite this fierce reputation, Ares's nature was not wholly one-dimensional. His violence, though necessary for the course of history, also brought him a deep sense of loneliness, alienation, and a struggle for recognition. This irony of a god who was both a figure of supreme power and yet one who faced constant criticism shapes the story of Ares' existence. While other gods were celebrated for their roles in shaping the world, Ares found little in the way of glory. His name became synonymous with bloodshed, but not with victory or honor. In many myths, Ares was portrayed as an outsider among the Olympians, a god whose fierce nature alienated him from his fellow deities. He was often depicted as impulsive and reckless, a figure who sought the thrill of battle for its own sake rather than for any noble purpose. In contrast to Athena, who embodied the strategic side of war, Ares' approach was one of uncontrolled aggression. While Athena could guide warriors with wisdom, Ares reveled in the chaos of the fight. He embodied the wild, destructive side of battle, the part that destroyed lives, cities, and entire civilizations. His role in war was not to bring order or peace, but to feed the insatiable hunger of conflict. It is this aspect of Ares that made him both a vital force in Greek mythology and a deeply tragic figure. War, in Ares' world, was a cycle that could never be broken. It was not a means to an end, but an end in itself. The very essence of Ares was defined by this contradiction. He was both a necessary part of the divine order and yet a figure who seemed to be in constant opposition to the other gods. Where Athena stood for wisdom and strategy, Ares stood for chaos and destruction. Yet, despite this, the gods could not do without him. War, after all, was an essential part of the human experience. Even the gods themselves could not escape the need for battle, and so Ares' violent nature became an indispensable force in the world. He was not a god to be loved, but a god to be feared, and yet his existence was one that even the gods themselves had to respect. The irony of Ares' violent nature is also evident in the way he was perceived by mortals. While some saw him as a necessary figure, one who could lend strength and courage in the heat of battle, others viewed him as a symbol of destruction and death. In the eyes of many mortals, Ares was a god to be appeased rather than worshipped. While they may have offered sacrifices in his name before heading into battle, few actually revered him for the qualities he represented. Instead, they feared his wrath, for they knew that Ares was not a god who brought victory or glory, but a god who brought suffering, bloodshed, and death. One of the most striking aspects of Ares' mythological journey is the way in which he struggled to find acceptance among the other gods. Unlike Zeus, the king of the gods, or Athena, the goddess of wisdom, Ares did not have the same level of respect among the Olympians. While other gods could boast of their achievements, whether in love, intellect, or leadership, Ares was often seen as little more than a disruptive force. He was not a god who brought harmony to the world, but one who reveled in the chaos of battle. This alienation is what made Ares such a tragic figure. He was a god who embodied the very essence of conflict, yet was never fully embraced by the divine realm. There is also an irony in Ares' relationships with his fellow gods, particularly with his father Zeus. Zeus, the king of the gods, was a god who presided over both the heavens and the earth, maintaining order and balance in the cosmos. Yet, even Zeus, with all his power, could not escape the consequences of war. Though he was often seen as a god who sought peace and resolution, Zeus was forced to call upon Ares when battle became inevitable. In many ways, Ares was a reminder that even the highest gods could not escape the destructive forces of conflict. The irony lies in the fact that Ares, as the god of war, was not just an embodiment of chaos, but also a necessary instrument in maintaining the balance of the divine world. In some myths, Ares' violence and aggression were even shown to be a source of great personal suffering. Though he was a god of immense power, Ares was not immune to the vulnerability that came with his violent nature. In several stories, Ares was wounded in battle, a rare occurrence for a god who was seen as indestructible. These wounds were not just physical, they were symbolic of the emotional and psychological toll of constant conflict. Ares, the god of war, was not immune to the same suffering that he inflicted upon others. He was a god who was, in many ways, defined by his contradictions, a being who could inspire terror on the battlefield, but who also bore the scars of his own destructive nature. This paradox of Ares's nature, of a god who was both feared and alienated, both necessary and destructive, speaks to a larger truth about the nature of war itself. War, like Ares, is a force that is simultaneously essential and tragic. It is a force that shapes the course of history, yet leaves behind a wake of destruction and suffering. Ares, as the personification of this force, embodies the duality of conflict, the way in which war can both create and destroy, build and ruin in equal measure. Ares' violent nature is also a reminder of the inescapable reality of conflict. Though gods may seek peace and mortals may long for harmony, the violence of war remains a constant presence in the world. Ares is a god who embodies this violence, not as a malevolent force, but as an inevitable part of existence. His actions are not driven by malice or hatred, but by the unrelenting force of war itself, a force that cannot be ignored or escaped. In this way, Ares is both a necessary part of the divine world and a tragic reminder of the destructive power of conflict. In Greek mythology, the war between the Olympian gods and the giants, known as the Gigantomachy, was one of the most monumental and destructive conflicts in the ancient world. This great battle pitted the gods of Mount Olympus against a race of powerful, monstrous beings born from the earth, the giants, who sought to overthrow the divine order and seize control of the heavens. As the embodiment of war, Ares played a significant role in this conflict, participating in the battle with his usual ferocity and power. The Gigantomachy was not just a war between gods and giants. It was a cosmic struggle for the balance of power in the universe. The giants, with their immense size and strength, were formidable foes, capable of shaking the foundations of Olympus itself. Their rebellion was driven by a desire to overturn the reign of the Olympian gods and replace them with a new order, one in which the giants would rule supreme. To prevent this, the gods united in a great battle to defend their sovereignty and ensure that the natural order was preserved. Ares, as the god of war, was a natural participant in this conflict. He was not only the embodiment of battle, but also the force that kept wars alive, fueling their violence and chaos. His involvement in the Gigantomachy was marked by his brutal aggression, his instinct for destruction, and his deep understanding of the primal nature of combat. Unlike some of the other gods, who may have fought with strategy or intellect, Ares was in his element, fueled by the raw, untamed energy of conflict. As the gods and giants clashed on the battlefield, Ares found himself at the heart of the action. In some versions of the myth, he is depicted as fighting alongside his fellow gods, charging into battle with a ferocity that was unmatched. His strength and experience in combat made him a vital asset to the Olympians, who needed his power to stand against the formidable might of the giants. The giants, for their part, were not easily intimidated, and many of them were fierce warriors in their own right, possessing abilities that made them nearly as powerful as the gods themselves. However, Ares' bloodlust and unwavering commitment to the destruction of his enemies made him a force to be reckoned with on the battlefield. Ares' participation in the Gigantomachy also highlighted his unique nature as a god. Unlike his fellow Olympians, Ares was not fighting for a higher cause or for the preservation of cosmic balance. His involvement in the war was driven purely by his need for violence and conflict. The giants represented a challenge, an opportunity for Ares to prove his might and to feed the insatiable hunger for war that defined his essence. He was not concerned with the moral or philosophical implications of the battle. For Ares, the fight itself was what mattered. His role in the Gigantomachy was that of a warrior who thrived in the chaos and bloodshed of war, embracing the violence without hesitation or remorse. The Gigantomachy was a brutal, exhausting battle that tested the gods to their limits. The giants, though not as skilled in combat as the Olympians, were formidable opponents due to their immense size and strength. In many accounts, the gods were required to use every ounce of their power to defeat the giants, and even then, the victory was hard won. Ares, as the god of war, was an essential part of this victory, helping to turn the tide in favor of the Olympians. His violent nature was a driving force behind the god's success, for his presence on the battlefield was one that could strike fear into the hearts of the giants, weakening their resolve. Despite Ares' vital role in the battle, the Gigantomachy was not a simple victory for the gods. The war had far-reaching consequences, leaving the divine world scarred and changed. Ares' participation in the conflict, while crucial, was also a reminder of the destructive power of war itself, both in the divine realm and the mortal world. The gods, despite their ultimate victory, were forever changed by the events of the Gigantomachy. They had witnessed firsthand the sheer violence that Ares represented, and they understood the true cost of conflict. In some versions of the myth, Ares is also depicted as being wounded in the battle. Though Ares was a powerful god, even he was not immune to the destructive forces of the Gigantomachy. This injury was symbolic, reminding the gods and mortals alike that even the most powerful can be brought low by the violence they embody. Ares, despite his reputation as the god of war, was vulnerable in a way that many did not expect. The wound he received was not only physical, but also emotional. It represented the toll that war takes on all who are caught in its grasp, even the gods who bring it about. The Gigantomachy also marked a turning point for Ares as a god. Though he had long been associated with the chaos and violence of war, the battle with the giants gave him a new sense of purpose. No longer merely a god of destruction, Ares was now a protector of the divine order. His role in the battle was not just to fight for the sake of battle itself, but to defend the very foundation of the god's rule. In this sense, Ares' participation in the Gigantomachy was both a reflection of his violent nature and a necessary act of defense. It was a battle that forced Ares to confront the destructive forces he represented, while also allowing him to assert his place in the divine hierarchy. After the battle, Ares' reputation as a god of war only grew. He was not a god who sought glory or recognition, but his actions in the Gigantomachy solidified his place as one of the most powerful and feared deities in the Greek pantheon. His victory over the giants was a reminder of his importance in the divine world, a god whose strength and bloodlust could shape the outcome of battles and determine the fate of entire realms. Though Ares was not always revered in the same way as other gods, his role in the Gigantomachy was a testament to his power and his unwavering commitment to the forces of war. The Gigantomachy also reinforced Ares's connection to the primal aspects of existence. He was not merely a god of war in the sense that Athena was, a strategist and a guide for warriors. Ares was a god who represented the chaotic, uncontrollable nature of conflict itself. His participation in the Gigantomachy reminded the gods and mortals alike that war, at its heart, is a force that cannot be tamed or easily understood. It is a force that is as old as the gods themselves, one that shapes the world in ways both destructive and necessary. Ares, the god of war, and Zeus, the king of the gods, are two of the most prominent figures in Greek mythology. While Ares is often portrayed as a fierce and impulsive god of violence, Zeus is known for his leadership and wisdom, ruling over the heavens and the earth with a sense of authority. Despite their shared divine heritage, the relationship between Ares and Zeus was one of complexity, shaped by both mutual respect and underlying tension. As father and son, their dynamic reveals much about the roles they played in the cosmic order and the ways in which power, authority, and nature intersected within the pantheon of the gods. Ares' relationship with Zeus was not always one of harmony. As the god of war, Ares embodied the chaotic and destructive aspects of conflict, forces that were often at odds with Zeus's vision of order and stability. Zeus, as the king of the gods, was concerned with maintaining balance in the cosmos, while Ares sought to perpetuate the violence and turmoil that were intrinsic to war. This fundamental difference in their purposes created a tension between them, even though they were bound by the familial ties of father and son. From the earliest myths, it becomes clear that Zeus often viewed Ares' role in the divine order with a sense of ambivalence. While Zeus understood the necessity of conflict in maintaining the balance of power, he did not always approve of the way Ares embraced war for its own sake. Unlike other gods, such as Athena, who fought for victory and strategy, Ares reveled in the sheer chaos and destruction that war brought. For Ares, war was not merely a means to an end. It was a force in and of itself, one that he sought to perpetuate. This impulsive and reckless nature clashed with Zeus's more measured and calculated approach to divine governance. In several myths, Ares' actions, his reckless pursuit of violence and bloodshed, are depicted as causing problems for the gods. In one well-known myth, Ares was sent by Zeus to aid the Trojans during the Trojan War. While Ares was a formidable warrior, his lack of strategy and disregard for the consequences of his actions led to chaos on the battlefield. At one point, Ares was even captured by the gods and held prisoner in chains by Athena, as a reminder that even the god of war was not beyond the reach of divine authority. Zeus, though somewhat tolerant of Ares' impulsive nature, would occasionally have to step in to ensure that his son did not bring too much chaos to the divine world. Despite this tension, Zeus and Ares did share a certain respect for one another. As the father of Ares, Zeus had a deep understanding of his son's nature and the role that he played in the world. While Zeus may have disapproved of Ares' methods, he understood that Ares was necessary to the balance of the universe. War, though destructive, was an inescapable part of life, both for mortals and for the gods. As the god who embodied this force, Ares played a critical role in the ongoing cycle of creation and destruction. In some myths, Zeus even provides Ares with his blessing, allowing him to participate in the most significant battles of the gods. During the Gigantomachy, the war between the Olympians and the giants, Zeus called upon Ares to join the fray, recognizing that his son's violent nature was essential to the defense of Olympus. While Zeus often sought to guide the gods toward peace and balance, he also knew that war, like it or not, was sometimes necessary. Ares, with his raw power and unrelenting energy, was the embodiment of this truth. Zeus also recognized the importance of Ares's role in the human world. Mortals, too, were drawn into the cycle of war, and it was through Ares that they found the strength to fight. Warriors and generals across ancient Greece offered prayers and sacrifices to Ares before going into battle, seeking his favor and hoping for victory. Zeus understood that Ares, though often a symbol of destruction, was also a god who could empower mortals to fight for their causes. Ares, like all the gods, had a role to play in the divine order, even if his nature often clashed with Zeus' desire for peace. At times, Ares' impulsiveness and his unchecked passion for battle led him to act without consulting his father. In some myths, Ares is depicted as a god who rushes into action without thinking of the consequences. For instance, during the Trojan War, Ares frequently changed allegiances, fighting for whichever side seemed to offer the most excitement. This lack of consistency and his tendency to act on instinct rather than reason made him unpredictable in the eyes of Zeus. It was a trait that made Ares both dangerous and indispensable. He was a god who could inspire fear and lead warriors into battle, but he was also a god whose recklessness could lead to unintended consequences. One of the more striking moments, Morten, their relationship comes during the Iliad, where Zeus, though clearly displeased by Ares's actions, does not hesitate to intervene on his son's behalf. When Ares is wounded by the mortal hero Diomedes, Zeus is forced to step in, offering his support and allowing Ares to recover. This act of fatherly concern, however, is tempered by the fact that Zeus is also displeased by the way his son conducts himself. While Zeus does not punish Ares for his recklessness, his intervention highlights the complexity of their relationship. Zeus is both a father who cares for his son and a ruler who must maintain control over the forces of chaos. At other times, the tension between Zeus and Ares was less about personal affection and more about the roles they played in the divine world. Zeus, as the king of the gods, sought to maintain order and peace among the Olympians, while Ares was a god whose very nature was aligned with disorder and conflict. While Zeus sought to guide the gods and mortals toward stability, Ares represented the force that could easily unravel that stability. This fundamental difference in their natures often led to clashes, whether in the form of direct confrontation or more subtle moments of tension. Despite the occasional friction, Ares's relationship with Zeus was one of mutual understanding. Zeus knew that Ares was a force that could not be easily controlled, nor could he be dismissed as irrelevant. Ares was, in his own way, as much a part of the divine order as Zeus himself. The two gods may have had differing approaches to their roles, but they were both necessary in the grand scheme of things. Ares' warlike nature, for all its destructive power, was an integral part of the balance that Zeus sought to maintain. Ultimately, the relationship between Ares and Zeus was one of both conflict and cooperation. Zeus may have disapproved of Ares' impulsive and chaotic nature, but he also recognized the importance of his son in the larger cosmic order. Ares, though often rebellious and violent, was a god whose power was essential to the ongoing cycle of creation, destruction, and rebirth. In this way, Their relationship, though complicated, reflects the larger dynamics of the Greek pantheon. Gods who are both connected and at odds, bound by the forces that govern the universe, yet driven by their own distinct desires and purposes. The Iliad, one of the most famous epic poems of ancient Greece, is a cornerstone of Western literature, telling the story of the final year of the Trojan War. Within this vast narrative, the gods themselves play a crucial role, intervening in mortal affairs, guiding heroes, and shaping the course of the conflict. Among the gods that the Iliad brings to life, Ares, the god of war, stands out as a complex and sometimes controversial figure. His portrayal in Homer's epic reveals both his power and his flaws, offering a deeper understanding of the nature of war, violence, and the gods themselves. In the Iliad, Ares is depicted not as a central character, but as one whose actions significantly influence the war between the Greeks and the Trojans. His involvement in the battle is marked by his fierce aggression and desire for conflict, but also by his vulnerability and the sense that his power, while formidable, is not without its limitations. Ares' role in the Iliad is as a god who thrives on war, but struggles with the consequences of his own nature. Unlike Athena, who is portrayed as a strategic and calculating deity, one who guides warriors to victory through wisdom, Ares is shown as a god of chaos and impulse. While Athena directs her influence toward victory and honor, Ares revels in the destruction of battle itself. His very presence on the battlefield is a symbol of the violence and bloodshed that war brings, and he often appears in the Iliad when conflict reaches its most brutal and intense points. Ares is not concerned with the morality of the war, he is concerned only with the thrill of combat. Ares' first significant appearance in the Iliad occurs in Book 5, when he is described as fighting on the side of the Trojans, eager to join the fray. The context of this appearance is important because it highlights the primal and impulsive nature of Ares. Unlike other gods who might weigh the consequences of their actions, Ares is driven by an insatiable need to fight. In the Iliad, war is not simply a means to an end for Ares, it is an end in itself. He does not fight for glory or honor, but for the sheer enjoyment of violence and destruction. This sets him apart from gods like Athena, who use war as a means of achieving a greater strategic purpose. In his role in the battle, Ares is depicted as a powerful and terrifying force. His armor is described as shining like fire, and his presence on the battlefield strikes fear into the hearts of the warriors around him. He charges into combat with a kind of recklessness, embodying the destructive power of war in its rawest form. Yet, his participation in the conflict is also marked by a sense of futility. Ares, for all his strength, is not a god who seeks to end the war or bring about a lasting resolution. Instead, he is driven by a need to perpetuate the violence and chaos that comes with it. In this way, Ares' role in the Iliad becomes a commentary on the nature of war itself, an endless cycle of destruction that does not lead to peace, but to more bloodshed. One of the most telling moments in Ares' involvement in the Iliad occurs when he is wounded by the Greek hero Diomedes. In Book 5, Diomedes, with the help of Athena, strikes Ares with a spear, causing the god of war to retreat from the battlefield in pain. This injury is significant for several reasons. First, it shows that even the mightiest of the gods are vulnerable in the heat of battle. Ares, despite his fearsome nature, is not invincible. His wound also marks a shift in the battle, as Diomedes, empowered by the goddess Athena, turns the tide against the Trojans. For Ares, the wound is not just a physical injury, but a symbol of his own vulnerability. The realization that even a god of war can be defeated in the midst of conflict. The scene in which Ares is wounded by Diomedes also underscores another aspect of his nature, his emotional response to pain and defeat. After being struck, Ares retreats to Olympus, where he complains to Zeus about the injustice of being wounded by a mortal. He is deeply upset, not only by the physical injury, but by the fact that it was inflicted by a mortal warrior, someone who should have been beneath him. This reaction reveals the fragility of Ares's pride. Though he is a god of immense power, his ego is just as vulnerable as his body. He seeks solace from his father Zeus, who, though sympathetic, does not intervene in the conflict on Ares's behalf. Zeus's response to Ares's complaint is telling. While he listens to his son's grievances, he does not provide the same kind of protection or intervention that he might offer to other gods. Instead, Zeus reminds Ares that the will of the gods is not always aligned with the desires of the individual gods. The gods may fight and intervene in mortal affairs, but they must also abide by the larger forces at work in the world. This moment is significant because it highlights the tension between Ares' desire for power and the limitations that even the gods must face. Ares may be a god of war, but he is not immune to the complexities and challenges that come with the pursuit of power. Despite this setback, Ares does not retreat from the war. He returns to the battlefield, continuing his fight alongside the Trojans. His presence is a reminder of the inescapable nature of conflict, both for mortals and gods alike. Ares' actions in the Iliad emphasize the brutal, cyclical nature of war, a force that cannot be easily controlled or overcome. For Ares, war is not a means to achieve an end. It is the very essence of his being, and it is something he cannot escape. Ares' involvement in the Iliad is also marked by his shifting allegiances. Though he initially fights on the side of the Trojans, his actions in the war are not always consistent. At one point, Ares is even depicted as standing alone on the battlefield, fighting against both sides. This erratic behavior further emphasizes the chaos that Ares embodies. Unlike Athena, who fights with a sense of purpose and strategy, Ares is a god who thrives on unpredictability and violence. His role in the war is not to bring about a resolution, but to perpetuate the destruction that defines the conflict. The Iliad portrays Ares as a god who is both indispensable and ultimately tragic. While his strength and presence are crucial to the war, his lack of strategy, his impulsiveness, and his need for chaos make him a destabilizing force. He is a reminder of the darker side of war, the part that is not driven by honor or justice, but by rage, fear, and the primal instinct to destroy. Ares may be a powerful and fearsome god, but his role in the Iliad is also a cautionary tale about the destructive power of violence, even when wielded by the gods themselves. Ares, the god of war, was one of the most powerful and fearsome of the Olympian gods. His very presence on the battlefield was a symbol of the unrelenting nature of conflict, destruction, and violence. Yet, for all his might, Ares was not immune to vulnerability. In fact, one of the most telling moments in his mythological journey occurs when he is captured and bound by the other gods, a moment that reveals not only his physical limitations, but also the complex nature of his existence as a god of war. The story of Ares's binding takes place during the Trojan War, a conflict in which Ares, as was his nature, played an active and chaotic role. While the gods frequently intervened in the affairs of mortals, Ares' involvement in the war was marked by his reckless and impulsive nature, which often put him at odds with other gods. Unlike Athena, who fought with wisdom and strategy, Ares was driven by the raw, unrestrained force of battle itself. His behavior was often unpredictable, and this quality would eventually lead to his capture by the other gods. The moment of Ares' binding occurs in Book 5 of the Iliad, when he is engaged in combat on the side of the Trojans. As the battle intensifies, Ares, like many of the gods, becomes involved in the fray, charging into battle with all the fury that defines him. However, despite his strength and power, Ares is not immune to the limits of his divine nature. In the midst of the battle, Ares encounters Athena, the goddess of wisdom and strategy, who represents the more controlled and disciplined aspects of war. Unlike Ares, who thrives on the violence and chaos of battle, Athena fights with purpose, guiding warriors with her strategic mind. In the myth, Athena intervenes to stop Ares from continuing his destructive rampage. She strikes him with a blow that sends him reeling, temporarily throwing him off balance. This moment is symbolic. It marks the first time in the Iliad that Ares is physically overcome by another god. For Ares, a god who was used to being a dominant force on the battlefield, this defeat is significant. He is the embodiment of war, yet here he is, vulnerable and incapacitated, at the mercy of another god. The moment of his capture underscores the irony of Ares' existence. As a god who thrives on the chaos of war, he is also subject to the whims of other gods, who possess the power to control his actions. After Ares is struck by Athena, he is captured by the gods, who bind him in chains. This binding is not a physical restraint alone, but also a symbol of Ares' inability to escape the consequences of his own nature. In a way, his capture represents the limits of the very force he embodies. Ares, who is so often associated with unrestrained violence, is here forced into submission, illustrating the paradox of his existence. While Ares is a god of immense power, his actions and behavior are not without consequence. Even he, the god of war, can be bound by the very forces of order and strategy that he rejects. Ares' binding is also a moment of humiliation for the god. For all his strength and power, he is rendered helpless and subject to the authority of the other gods. This vulnerability is a rare and significant moment in the mythology of Ares, as it challenges the perception of him as an invincible force of nature. In the Iliad, Ares' vulnerability serves to remind both the gods and the mortals that, despite his fearsome reputation, even the most powerful beings are not beyond the reach of others. Ares may be a god of war, but he is still subject to the rules and limitations of the divine order. The gods who bind Ares, including Hera and Zeus, are acting to preserve the balance of power on Mount Olympus. Ares' unchecked aggression and reckless participation in the war are seen as a threat to that balance. In a sense, his binding is a necessary act to prevent him from disrupting the order of things. While the other gods recognize the importance of war and conflict in the world, they also understand that unchecked violence and chaos can lead to destruction, not just for mortals, but for the gods themselves. Ares' behavior, while an essential part of the cosmic cycle of war, must be controlled. His binding serves as a reminder that even the gods, no matter how powerful, must abide by certain laws that govern the universe. After Ares is bound, he is brought before the gods, who ridicule him for his vulnerability and his inability to control his impulses. The gods mock him, laughing at his plight and taking pleasure in his humiliation. This moment of ridicule further emphasizes Ares' status as an outsider among the Olympians. While the other gods, such as Zeus, Athena, and Hera, often work together to maintain the balance of the cosmos, Ares is portrayed as a figure who is at odds with their efforts. He is a god who cannot be tamed, whose violence and chaos cannot be easily controlled. Even when captured and bound, Ares remains a symbol of the uncontrollable force of war. However, despite the mockery he faces, Ares is eventually freed from his chains. His release is not one of complete forgiveness or restoration, but rather a recognition of the complexity of his role in the divine order. Ares is a necessary force in the universe, and while his behavior may be disruptive at times, the gods understand that they cannot entirely eliminate the power he represents. War is a natural and inevitable part of existence, and Ares, as its embodiment, must be allowed to return to the battlefield, though his actions must be tempered by the other gods. Ares' binding, though humiliating, ultimately serves to highlight his complex role in the pantheon of Greek gods. He is a figure who is both feared and misunderstood, a god whose power is both necessary and dangerous. His capture and subsequent release reflect the delicate balance that exists between chaos and order, violence and strategy. Ares' nature as a god of war is not one that can be easily controlled or contained, but it is a force that must be acknowledged and managed by the other gods. In many ways, the story of Ares' binding reflects the broader themes of Greek mythology. It is a reminder that even the most powerful beings, whether gods or mortals, are subject to forces beyond their control. Ares, the god of war, is no exception. His binding is a moment of vulnerability that serves to remind us of the limitations of power and the importance of balance in the divine world. Ares, the god of war, is often depicted as a figure of relentless aggression and destructive force, embodying the primal and chaotic nature of battle. While he was not as beloved or revered as some of the other gods of the Greek pantheon, his influence on the world of mortals and immortals was undeniable. One of the more profound aspects of Ares' mythology is his role as a father, especially through his children, who in many ways reflect the very nature of war that he embodies. His offspring, born from both divine and mortal relationships, would come to personify the terror, fear, and destructive power that Ares himself unleashed upon the world. Perhaps the most famous of Ares' children are Phobos and Deimos, twin sons who personified fear and terror. Their birth, like many myths surrounding Ares, speaks to the essential role that war plays in shaping the emotions and experiences of those caught in its grasp. While Ares himself represented the raw force of violence, Phobos and Deimos represented the psychological impact of war, the fear that paralyzes soldiers, the terror that grips hearts before battle, and the lingering dread that follows in the wake of destruction. Together, they encapsulate the emotional toll of war, not just on the body, but on the mind and spirit. Phobos and Deimos were often depicted as accompanying their father on the battlefield, riding in his chariot as symbols of the terror and chaos that followed in the wake of Ares' presence. They were the manifestations of fear that caused warriors to falter, to hesitate, and to ultimately succumb to the horrors of war. In many ways, their roles were to amplify the destructive force that Ares brought to the battlefield. Their very presence served to destabilize the enemy, sowing panic and disorder, making Ares's victories all the more complete. In some myths, Phobos and Deimos were said to be the companions of Ares in his role as a god of war, often appearing on the battlefield as spectres of dread. They were not merely figures of terror, but were active agents of chaos, manipulating the emotions of those who fought in the wars of the gods and mortals. Phobos, the personification of fear, was particularly powerful in his ability to influence the minds of soldiers, causing them to flee in terror or hesitate in moments of crucial battle. Deimos, his twin, embodied the more overwhelming aspect of terror, an all-consuming panic that threatened to destroy a soldier's resolve entirely. These children of Ares played an integral role in the psychological landscape of war, where the true battle often raged in the hearts and minds of the warriors themselves. In many ways, their influence was far more insidious than the physical violence of war. A soldier might recover from a wound, but the terror that Phobos and Deimos instilled in him could last a lifetime. War, in the mythological sense, was not just a series of physical battles. It was a battle of the mind, where the fear and terror embodied by Ares's children were just as dangerous as any weapon or army. The children of Ares were not limited to Phobos and Deimos. In some versions of the myth, Ares fathered other children with mortal women, resulting in warriors and heroes who inherited his fierce nature and capacity for violence. These offspring were often portrayed as formidable fighters, their power and skill in battle unmatched. Like their father, they embodied the relentless nature of war, and their actions often carried significant consequences for the mortals and gods involved. For example, in some myths, Ares is said to have fathered the warrior Erymanthos, who was known for his incredible strength and prowess in battle. Erymanthos, like his father, fought with an intensity that was often beyond reason, driven by the very instincts that made Ares such a feared figure on the battlefield. The offspring of Ares were often depicted as embodiments of raw power, their very presence bringing an aura of violence and destruction. They were not mere children. They were warriors in their own right, each carrying the legacy of Ares' warlike nature into their own lives. Despite their power, the children of Ares were also marked by the same contradictions that defined their father. While they were revered for their strength and combat abilities, they were also feared for the very traits that made them dangerous. The sons and daughters of Ares were often depicted as beings who lived in the shadow of their father's influence, constantly grappling with the dualities of violence and honor, destruction and legacy. They were warriors born of war itself, yet often trapped by the very nature of the conflict they embodied. Ares' relationship with his children was not without its complexities. Though Ares was a father figure to many of his offspring, he was also a figure who represented the chaos of war, a force that could be both protective and destructive. His children, born from both divine and mortal relationships, inherited the strength of their father, but also the internal conflict that came with being the offspring of a god of war. They were warriors, but they were also the bearers of a legacy that often led to violence, suffering, and inner turmoil. The birth of Phobos and Deimos, as well as other children of Ares, highlights the profound impact that war has on both the divine and mortal realms. While Ares himself was a god who lived for battle, His children were a testament to the psychological and emotional consequences of war. Phobos and Deimos represented the terror that war brings, not just to those who fight, but to the very fabric of existence itself. Their very names are a reminder that the effects of war are not confined to the battlefield. They extend into the hearts and minds of those who are caught in its wake. In many ways, Ares' children embody the paradoxes of his own existence. Ares was not just a god of war. He was a god whose very essence was defined by violence and destruction. Yet, like the gods and mortals around him, Ares' legacy was shaped by his relationships. His relationship with his children, his role in the cosmic order, and his struggle to reconcile his violent nature with the other forces at play in the universe. His children, like him, were both powerful and vulnerable, embodying the complexities of war in their own right. As we consider the children of Ares, we see not only the continuation of his legacy as the god of war, but also the consequences of that legacy: fear, terror, and the emotional scars left by conflict. Ares, as a father, was not just a god who fathered warriors. He fathered the very essence of war itself. His children were born into a world where conflict was a constant force, and their lives, like their fathers, were shaped by the destructive power of battle. In the end, the children of Ares remind us that war is not just a physical act. It is a force that shapes hearts, minds, and legacies, often long after the battle has ended. Ares, the god of war, was not only a force of chaos and violence, but also a symbol of the unrelenting power that conflict exerts on both mortals and gods. While his violent nature is often the focal point of his character, one of the most significant and symbolic aspects of Ares' appearance and mythological persona is his chariot. This chariot, which Ares is often depicted riding into battle, is not just a tool for transportation. It is an extension of his divine power and an emblem of his role as the god of war. The imagery of Ares' chariot underscores his relentless, unstoppable nature and the violent force he represents. In Greek mythology, the chariot was more than just a mode of transport. It was an essential symbol of a warrior's might and prestige. Gods and heroes alike used chariots to show their power, speed, and combat readiness. For Ares, his chariot was not just a vehicle. It was a manifestation of his role as the embodiment of war itself. His chariot is often described as being drawn by fierce horses, symbolizing the unstoppable force of his destructive power. These horses, like their master, were wild and untamed, matching Ares' chaotic and violent nature. The chariot of Ares was often depicted as a magnificent and fearsome sight. It was not a simple utilitarian chariot like those used by mortals in war. Rather, it was a divine vehicle, imbued with the power and grandeur befitting a god. In some depictions, Ares' chariot is described as gleaming with fire-like radiance, reflecting the intensity and destruction of the battlefields that he ruled. His horses, likewise, were often portrayed as embodiments of war and violence, sometimes even as personifications of the destructive forces of war itself. These horses were often seen galloping with fury, embodying the destructive energy that Ares commanded. Ares' chariot, with its fiery radiance and fierce horses, became a symbol of his divine power on the battlefield. It was not simply a means for Ares to travel from one place to another. It was a representation of his nature as a god of violence and destruction. The imagery of Ares driving his chariot into battle evoked a sense of inevitability, the unstoppable force of war with Ares at its helm. The chariot was a visual reminder that Ares was not just a participant in war, but its very embodiment, leading his forces into battle as if driven by the very essence of conflict. In many of the myths, Ares is depicted riding into battle in his chariot, where his presence alone is enough to strike fear into the hearts of his enemies. The chariot, often seen as a sign of a powerful and commanding figure, made Ares's appearance on the battlefield all the more imposing. When Ares entered the fray, his chariot was a signal of the destructive power that followed him, an unstoppable force that could not be avoided or reasoned with. Whether fighting alongside the Trojans or the Greeks, Ares' chariot was always a symbol of his aggressive and chaotic nature, a reminder of the violence that he represented. The horses that pulled Ares' chariot were just as symbolic as the chariot itself. These horses were not just animals. They were divine creatures, infused with the power of Ares and the violent forces of war. The horses were often depicted as fierce and untamed, embodying the chaos of the battlefields that Ares ruled over. In some myths, these horses were said to have the ability to carry Ares across vast distances with the speed and force of a thunderbolt, making him a nearly invincible presence on the battlefield. The horses, like Ares himself, were symbols of the unstoppable force of war. The chariot of Ares also reflects his role as a god who is not merely an observer of war, but an active participant in it. Unlike other gods who may guide or inspire mortals in war, Ares is always at the forefront of the action. His chariot is a symbol of his direct involvement in the destruction that war brings. Whether in the Iliad or in other myths, Ares is frequently depicted as driving his chariot into the heart of battle, where he takes part in the chaos and bloodshed, always leading from the front. His chariot, then, is not just a tool, but a sign of his divine purpose to bring destruction and violence wherever he goes. Ares' chariot also serves as a reminder of the divine nature of war itself. While mortal warriors used chariots as tools of warfare, Ares' chariot was a divine instrument, imbued with the power and energy of the gods. It was a vehicle not just of physical transport, but of divine will, carrying Ares into battle as he fulfilled his role as the god of war. In this sense, Ares' chariot symbolizes the divine nature of conflict, the way in which war, while destructive and chaotic, is also an integral part of the cosmos, shaping the world and the gods in its wake. Through Ares' chariot, we see how war is not just a human affair, but a divine force that shapes the very nature of existence. In some myths, Ares' chariot is also seen as a symbol of his connection to other gods. While Ares may embody the destructive power of war, his chariot serves as a reminder that he is not alone in his role. The horses that pull his chariot are often depicted as being under the command of other gods, such as Apollo or Hera, suggesting that even Ares, as a god of war, must work within the larger framework of divine order. His chariot, then, represents both the individual power of Ares and his role within the broader structure of the gods, who govern and shape the forces of the universe. The symbolism of Ares' chariot extends beyond the battlefield. It is also a reminder of the inevitability of war. The chariot, with its blazing radiance and fearsome horses, represents the destructive power of war that cannot be avoided. Just as Ares drives his chariot into the heart of conflict, so too does war inevitably emerge in the world, uncontrollable, relentless, and inescapable. The chariot is a visual metaphor for the way in which war comes upon civilizations, sweeping them up in its chaos and destruction. Ares, as the god who embodies this force, is always at the center of it, leading the charge into conflict. In the broader context of Greek mythology, the image of Ares' chariot serves to remind us of the duality of war. War, like Ares, is both necessary and destructive. The chariot of Ares, as a symbol of his power, reflects both the glory and the horror of battle. It is a tool of violence, but it is also a symbol of divine will. Ares' chariot does not just carry him to battle, it carries the very essence of war itself, a force that can create as much as it can destroy, that can build kingdoms, but also tear them down. It is a reminder that while the gods may control the forces of nature, they are also subject to them, caught in the same cycle of creation and destruction that governs the world. The fall of Troy, as told in Greek mythology, is one of the most poignant and tragic moments in the ancient world. It is a tale of heroism, betrayal, divine intervention, and the unstoppable tide of war. For Ares, the god of war, the fall of Troy represents the culmination of his role in the divine drama of battle. Throughout the Trojan War, Ares was deeply involved in the fighting, taking sides and wielding his destructive power in both the mortal and divine realms. However, the fall of Troy, marked by its betrayal and ultimate destruction, would also be a moment of reflection for Ares, one where his involvement in the endless cycle of violence is brought to its most dramatic conclusion. Ares' role in the Trojan War was not limited to a single battle or conflict. As the god of war, he was deeply immersed in the fighting, sometimes supporting the Trojans, other times the Greeks, depending on the divine whims and his own nature. His actions were often impulsive, driven by the chaos of war rather than any moral or strategic compass. Unlike Athena, who fought for wisdom and victory, Ares fought for the sheer violence and devastation that war brought. He reveled in the destruction, and his presence on the battlefield was a symbol of the bloodshed and chaos that defined the conflict. In many ways, Ares' involvement in the fall of Troy reflects his place in the larger scheme of things, the role he plays in the world of the gods and mortals. The gods may have orchestrated the war, but it was Ares who fueled its violence, creating an atmosphere of constant strife and bloodshed. His participation in the war was not just about physical combat, but about amplifying the chaos that permeated the conflict. For Ares, war was not merely a series of battles to be won or lost. It was an ongoing cycle of destruction, one that could never be fully resolved. Ares' actions during the fall of Troy are marked by his chaotic and unpredictable nature. At times, he fought for the Trojans, siding with them in the conflict, and at other times he fought against them, aligning himself with the Greeks. His allegiances, unlike those of other gods, were not driven by any larger moral considerations, but by the raw power of war itself. Ares' shifting loyalties throughout the war demonstrate his lack of interest in the outcome. For him, the conflict was not about victory or justice, but about the energy, the destruction, and the brutality that war unleashed. As the war reached its final days, Ares' involvement became even more intense. The Trojans, despite their great strength and valiant defense, could not withstand the overwhelming force of the Greeks, aided by the cunning strategies of Athena and the eventual betrayal of the Trojans by the Greeks, notably through the use of the Trojan horse. The Trojan horse was a symbol of subterfuge and deceit, a weapon that would eventually lead to the city's downfall. While Ares did not play a direct role in the Trojan horse trick, his influence on the war's outcome was undeniable. His chaotic and violent nature contributed to the atmosphere of unpredictability that allowed such a deception to succeed. In the final battle, as the Greeks breached the walls of Troy, Ares fought fiercely to protect the city. Yet it was clear that the Trojans were doomed. Even Ares, with all his might and destructive power, could not prevent the inevitable. The gods may have played their part in the war, but it was mortals who would carry out the final act of destruction. The Greeks, with the help of their divine allies, overran the city, and Troy fell, marking the end of the war. For Ares, the fall of Troy represented the tragic conclusion of a war that had lasted for years. It was a victory, but one that came at a great cost. The bloodshed, the death, and the suffering that Ares had witnessed on the battlefield were not just the consequences of mortal conflict. They were a reflection of his own divine nature. As the god of war, Ares had fueled the violence, but he had also become a part of it. The fall of Troy was not just the end of a city. It was the culmination of Ares' own tragic involvement in the cycle of destruction that war perpetuates. In some versions of the myth, Ares' role in the fall of Troy is framed as a moment of sorrow and regret. Though Ares is the god of war, he is not without emotions. The endless cycle of violence, the death of heroes, and the fall of a once great city weigh heavily on his conscience. For Ares, war is a force of nature, but it is also a source of personal anguish. He may be a god, but even he cannot escape the consequences of the destruction he brings. The fall of Troy is a reminder that even the gods are not immune to the suffering that war causes, even when they are the ones who drive it. In some interpretations, Ares' reaction to the fall of Troy can be seen as a moment of reflection. He realizes that the war, which had once seemed endless and inevitable, has now come to an end. The gods may continue their quarrels and their interventions, but the city of Troy, with all its heroes and tragedies, has been reduced to ashes. Ares, for all his power, could not stop the destruction. This realization is a somber moment for the god of war, who understands that, for all his strength, war is a cycle that can never be broken. It is a force that continues to shape the world, leaving behind devastation and ruin in its wake. The fall of Troy also marked the end of Ares' most significant role in Greek mythology. Though he would continue to appear in various myths, his influence in the Trojan War was the pinnacle of his involvement in mortal conflicts. After Troy's fall, Ares would become more of an outsider in the divine world. His chaotic nature and violent tendencies were no longer as central to the stories of the gods, who began to turn their attention toward new challenges. Yet, even as Ares faded from the forefront of Greek mythology, his legacy remained. He was the god who had shaped the course of history with his presence on the battlefield, and his influence, though less pronounced, would continue to be felt in the world of both gods and mortals. The fall of Troy, for Ares, was a final act of destruction, but it was also a reminder of the cost of war. The victory, achieved through bloodshed and deceit, was hollow. It was a war that Ares had fueled, but one that ultimately left him to face the empty consequences of his actions. In the end, Ares' involvement in the Trojan War was a testament to the timeless and tragic nature of war. a force that consumes, destroys, and leaves behind only sorrow in its wake. Ares, the god of war, was not only a central figure in the divine realm, but also a god of great importance in the mortal world. His power was felt on the battlefields of both gods and men, where violence and destruction shaped the lives of those involved. While Ares may not have been as widely worshipped as other gods like Athena or Apollo, he still held a significant place in the hearts of mortals, especially those who lived and died by the sword. Ares was revered by warriors, soldiers, and those whose lives were defined by the harsh realities of conflict. His worship was centered on his role as the god who could provide strength, courage, and victory in battle, but also a recognition of the darkness and terror that came with war. The cult of Ares was prominent in certain regions of ancient Greece, where war and martial prowess were highly valued. Among the most notable worshippers of Ares were the Spartans, a warrior society that revered the god as one of their primary deities. For the Spartans, war was not just a necessity, but a way of life. The very fabric of Spartan society was built around the ideals of strength, discipline, and combat readiness. Ares, as the embodiment of war, was seen as a god who could inspire these qualities in their soldiers. Temples were erected in his honor, and sacrifices were made to ensure his favor in battle. In Sparta, Ares' worship was often tied to the military ethos that dominated the city-state. Warriors would pray to Ares before heading into battle, seeking his strength and protection as they faced the dangers of warfare. The Spartans, who valued physical prowess and bravery above all else, saw Ares as a symbol of their martial ideals. His influence extended far beyond the battlefield, shaping the cultural identity of Sparta and the values that defined their way of life. The god of war was not just a deity to be feared. He was a patron of the warriors who carried out his will in battle, and in return, they honored him with their loyalty and devotion. Beyond Sparta, Ares was also worshipped in other regions where military culture was prominent. The god was often invoked by generals and leaders preparing for war, as his favor was seen as crucial to ensuring victory. His role as a protector and guide for warriors made him a popular deity among those whose lives were spent on the front lines. In times of war, when life and death were determined by the strength of one's arm, Ares was seen as the ultimate force behind a warrior's success or failure. Mortals turned to him for the courage to face their enemies, the strength to overcome their fears, and the victory that would elevate them above their rivals. However, Ares' worship was not without its complexities. While he was revered by warriors, his nature as the god of war also made him a figure of fear and reverence. War, after all, was not a clean or honorable endeavor. It was brutal, chaotic, and often filled with suffering. Ares was not a god of justice or righteousness. He was a god of destruction. His influence on the battlefield could be terrifying, and the consequences of invoking his power were often unpredictable. The god of war was as likely to bring ruin as he was to bring glory. His favor did not guarantee success. It only ensured that war would unfold with the same ferocity and unpredictability that marked his essence. In this way, Ares' worship also carried a darker, more ambivalent aspect. While warriors sought his strength and courage, they also acknowledged the costs of war. Ares was not just the god of victory, he was the god of bloodshed and death. His influence was not limited to the triumphs of battle, but extended to the suffering and devastation that war caused. In some myths, Ares' actions led to destruction that even he could not control, reinforcing the idea that war, though inevitable, was a force that consumed both its victors and its vanquished. The duality of Ares' nature was reflected in the way he was worshipped. While he was revered for his power in battle, his role as a god of violence and chaos was acknowledged by those who sought his favor. In some temples dedicated to Ares, offerings were made not just in the hopes of securing victory, but also in recognition of the cost of conflict. Warriors, generals, and kings alike sought his blessings, knowing that his power was unpredictable and that war, for all its glory, was never without its toll. Ares' worship also extended to other areas of Greek society. In some city-states, Ares was not just a god of war, but also a symbol of martial honor and discipline. In times of peace, his cult provided a means for communities to honor the warrior spirit and prepare for future conflicts. His role as the god of war made him an essential figure in the social and military fabric of ancient Greece, where warriors were revered and military training was central to society's values. Ares' worship was not limited to times of conflict. It was a constant reminder of the importance of strength, courage, and the ability to defend one's city and people. Yet, for all his importance in Greek society, Ares was not always seen as a god to be wholly admired. Unlike gods like Athena, who was respected for her wisdom and strategic thinking, Ares' presence in mythology was often more controversial. He was seen as a figure who reveled in the bloodshed and chaos of war, rather than in the honor or glory that often accompanied it. In this way, Ares was sometimes depicted as a god whose power was necessary, but whose influence was destructive. His worship was not about the pursuit of peace or justice, but about the relentless force of war and the destruction it wrought. While Ares provided warriors with the strength they needed to succeed in battle, he also reminded them of the cost of war, the lives lost, the families torn apart, and the psychological toll that conflict inflicted. Despite the darker aspects of his nature, Ares was a god who commanded respect. Even those who feared him acknowledged his power. His role as the god of war made him a figure that no one could ignore. Whether worshipped for his strength or feared for his violent nature, Ares remained a god who shaped the fate of mortals and gods alike. His legacy in Greek society was not just as a deity of destruction, but as a force that could not be denied, a reminder of the eternal cycle of war and the price that had to be paid for victory. In the end, Ares' worship reflects the complex relationship that ancient Greek society had with war and violence. He was a god who embodied both the glory and the horror of battle. He was revered by those who lived by the sword, but his influence also reminded mortals of the cost of conflict. As the god of war, Ares was both necessary and terrifying, a symbol of the power and the danger that came with the chaos of war. Ares, the god of war, was not only a central figure in the divine realm, but also a deity of profound importance to the warrior cultures of ancient Greece. His most significant and enduring worshippers were the Spartans, a society whose very identity was built around the ideals of martial prowess, discipline, and strength. In Sparta, Ares was more than just a god of destruction. He was a symbol of everything the Spartans valued in life: valor, honor, and the unyielding pursuit of victory in battle. For the Spartans, war was not merely a part of their existence. It was the foundation of their culture. Ares, as the embodiment of war itself, was naturally revered by this militaristic society. The relationship between Ares and Sparta was one of deep mutual respect, with the city-state viewing the god not only as a protector, but also as a patron who could inspire and guide their warriors. Ares was worshipped in temples, altars and shrines, where sacrifices and prayers were offered to him before battle. The Spartans, known for their rigorous military training and discipline, saw Ares as the ultimate source of strength and power on the battlefield. His presence, both as a symbol and as a divine force, was thought to imbue the warriors with the courage and fortitude needed to fight for their city-state, often at great personal cost. In the context of Spartan society, Ares was not simply a god to be worshipped. He was a figure who shaped the very nature of Spartan life. The Spartans were trained from a young age to be warriors. The education system, known as the agog, emphasized physical strength, endurance, and combat readiness, all with the aim of producing the most fearsome soldiers in the Greek world. In this environment, Ares' influence was ever present. The Spartan warriors, known for their discipline and valor, were not just fighting for glory or personal honor. They were fighting for the divine will of Ares, the god who represented their highest ideals. The Spartans also believed that their military success was directly linked to their devotion to Ares. As the god of war, Ares was seen as the force that guided their spears, sharpened their swords, and led them to victory in battle. In times of war, Spartan generals would make offerings to Ares, asking for his favor and strength. Ares' divine power was seen as the key to overcoming their enemies, and the warriors believed that their success on the battlefield was a reflection of his blessings. Sacrifices were made to him before significant military engagements, and the Spartans would pray for his protection and guidance in the heat of combat. One of the most iconic depictions of Ares in relation to Sparta is the association between the god and the Spartan warrior's ethos. The Spartan warrior was expected to embody Ares' qualities: courage, strength, and an unyielding commitment to victory. In Spartan art and literature, Ares was often depicted as a heroic figure, a god who not only represented the violence and destruction of war, but also the honor, glory, and righteousness that could come from martial success. For the Spartans, Ares was both a symbol of the physical might they sought to achieve and a spiritual force that justified their violent way of life. The Spartans were also known for their austere and disciplined way of life. Their society, focused on military excellence, was deeply shaped by their devotion to war and their god, Ares. Unlike other Greek city-states that may have placed more emphasis on intellectual or cultural pursuits, the Spartans placed all their energies into the preparation for and execution of war. Ares, as the god of war, was a constant presence in their lives. He was a figure of power, but also of discipline, a god whose strength was not just raw aggression, but also a strategic and calculated force. This reflected the Spartan approach to warfare, where efficiency, organization, and tactics were as important as brute force. However, Ares' influence in Sparta was not without its contradictions. While the god of war was revered, and his presence was essential to their way of life, there was also a recognition among the Spartans that war, in its most destructive form, was something to be feared. War was glorified in Spartan culture, but it also brought great pain and loss. Ares, as the god who embodied both the glory of battle and the suffering that came with it, was a reminder to the Spartans of the cost of conflict. While they sought his favor in battle, they were also aware that war was a double-edged sword, capable of both glory and devastation. The Spartans' relationship with Ares can also be seen in the way they honored him through public displays of strength. During military festivals and religious ceremonies, the Spartans would participate in events that celebrated their martial culture, with Ares at the center of these rites. These ceremonies were not just about honoring the god, but about reaffirming their commitment to the values that Ares represented: strength, courage, and the constant pursuit of excellence in battle. For the Spartans, the act of honoring Ares was not a passive ritual, but a way of reaffirming their identity as the greatest warriors of the Greek world. While Ares was a central figure in Spartan religion, his worship was not limited to military purposes. The god of war also had a place in Spartan society's broader spiritual life. Ares was seen as a protector of the city-state, safeguarding it from external threats and ensuring the strength and cohesion of the Spartan people. The Spartans believed that their unity in war was a reflection of the divine will of Ares, and their military successes were viewed as evidence of the god's favor. The sense of collective purpose that defined Sparta was tied to their belief in Ares' divine role in their military life. The god of war was not only a deity to be feared and appeased, but also one to be honored and revered as a cornerstone of Spartan identity. However, as with all things associated with war, Ares' role in Spartan society was not without its darker implications. The violence of battle, while glorified in Spartan culture, also carried with it the human cost of war. Ares' presence in the lives of the Spartans was a constant reminder of the destruction that warfare brings, both to those who fight and to those who are caught in the aftermath. While the Spartans may have seen Ares as a force of strength, they also recognized the toll that war took on the human spirit. This recognition of the dual nature of Ares, his power to both protect and destroy, was part of the broader understanding of war in Spartan society. In the end, Ares' worship in Sparta reflects the complexity of the god himself. He was a figure who embodied both the glory and the horror of war, a god who could inspire warriors to greatness but also bring about destruction and loss. The Spartans revered Ares not just for his power, but for the ways in which he shaped their identity and their way of life. For them, Ares was both a patron and a reminder of the cost of war, a god whose favor was essential for victory, but whose presence also spoke to the relentless and often tragic nature of the battles they fought. Ares, the god of war, was revered across ancient Greece, but his worship took on special significance in certain regions where his influence was particularly strong. One of the most prominent places where Ares was honored was Thrace, a region known for its warrior culture and its emphasis on martial prowess. The Thracians, like the Spartans, lived by the sword, and their society was built around the ideals of strength, combat, and victory. For them, Ares was not just a god of violence and destruction, but also a symbol of the power that war could bestow. The presence of a dedicated temple to Ares in Thrace speaks to the deep connection between the god and the culture of the people who worshipped him. The temple of Ares in Thrace was not just a place of religious devotion, it was a symbol of the Thracians' identity as a warrior society. construction of temples dedicated to gods like Ares was an important aspect of ancient Greek religious life. Temples were not only places of worship, they were also cultural centers that reflected the values and priorities of the people who built them. For the Thracians, Ares represented the very essence of their warrior culture, and the temples served as a focal point for their worship and reverence for the god of war. It was here that sacrifices were made, prayers were offered, and the warriors of Thrace sought the favor of Ares before heading into battle. The significance of Ares in Thrace was tied to the region's history and its constant state of warfare. Thrace was a land where tribes and kingdoms fought for dominance, where the clash of arms was a way of life. Ares, as the god who represented the brutal force of combat, was a fitting deity for such a society. The Thracians, who were known for their fierce and skillful warriors, saw Ares not just as a god of destruction, but also as a god who could provide them with the strength and courage to overcome their enemies. His favor was believed to ensure success in battle, and his presence in their lives was seen as a divine guarantee of military superiority. The temple dedicated to Ares in Thrace was not simply a place of worship. It was also a place where warriors could go to seek guidance and strength before heading into battle. The Thracians believed that Ares, with his mighty and destructive power, would imbue them with the courage to face their enemies without fear. In times of war, the temple would become a center of spiritual preparation, where warriors could offer sacrifices to Ares, asking for his protection and blessings. These sacrifices, which could include animals such as bulls or horses, were made in the hopes of securing Ares's favor and ensuring victory on the battlefield. The Ares temple in Thrace was not only a place for military leaders and warriors, it also served as a communal center for the people of the region. The worship of Ares was deeply intertwined with the daily lives of the Thracians, and the temple was a space where the values of strength, courage, and martial excellence were reinforced. It was here that the cultural and spiritual identity of the Thracians was expressed, where they came together to honor their god and to reinforce the central role that war and combat played in their society. The temple also played a role in the political and social life of the region. As the god of war, Ares was a powerful figure who was closely tied to the governance and leadership of the Thracian people. The kings and military leaders of Thrace would often visit the temple to offer prayers for success in their campaigns, seeking Ares's guidance and favor in their efforts to expand their territories or defend their borders. The kings of Thrace were not only secular rulers, but also religious leaders, and their relationship with Ares was seen as a reflection of their authority. By seeking Ares's favor, they hoped to ensure that their reigns were marked by military success and the growth of their power. The Thracian warriors who worshipped Ares were known for their distinctive fighting style and their fearsome reputation. The Thracians were expert horsemen and archers, and their knowledge of warfare was passed down through generations. Ares, as the embodiment of war, was seen as a protector of the warrior class. The Thracians' devotion to Ares was not just a reflection of their military culture, it was also a recognition of the hardships and sacrifices that war demanded. The warriors of Thrace understood that the path of war was one fraught with danger, and they turned to Ares for strength, guidance, and protection as they prepared for battle. The temple to Ares in Thrace also held a deeper cultural significance. It was a symbol of the connection between the Thracians and the wider Greek world, where Ares was worshipped as a powerful and fearsome god. The Thracians were part of a larger network of Greek-influenced cultures, and their worship of Ares aligned them with the broader values of strength and combat that were central to Greek martial societies. In this way, the Ares temple in Thrace represented the cultural ties between the Thracians and their Greek neighbors, as well as the shared belief in the divine power that war could bestow. The temple itself would have been a grand structure, designed to honor Ares in a way that reflected the importance of the god to the Thracians. While the specifics of the temple's architecture are lost to history, it would have likely been built in a style that reflected the grandeur and power of the god of war. Statues of Ares would have adorned the temple, depicting him as a powerful, muscular figure, often armed with a spear or shield, ready for battle. These statues would have served not only as objects of veneration, but also as visual reminders of the god's role in the lives of the people who worshipped him. In addition to its religious functions, the temple likely served as a center for the rituals and ceremonies that accompanied the preparation for war. These rituals would have included offerings of weapons, armor, and other symbols of martial excellence. The warriors of Thrace would have participated in these ceremonies to honor Ares and to seek his favor before embarking on their military campaigns. The temple thus became a place where the spiritual and martial aspects of Thracian life intersected, creating a space where divine and human forces worked together to shape the fate of the warriors and the people. The Ares temple at Thrace, in its physical and spiritual form, embodied the values and beliefs that defined the Thracian warrior culture. It was a place of strength, courage, and martial power, dedicated to a god who represented the violent and uncontrollable forces of war. The worship of Ares in Thrace was not just a reflection of the region's military culture. It was an expression of the belief that war was an essential part of life, a force that could be harnessed but never fully controlled. In this sense, the temple to Ares in Thrace was more than just a place of worship. It was a symbol of the enduring connection between the divine and the mortal, the sacred and the violent. While Ares was a prominent figure in Greek mythology, his influence and legacy extended well beyond Greece, leaving a significant mark on Roman culture and religion. In Roman mythology, Ares was known as Mars, and though there were some differences in the way he was portrayed, the core aspects of his character remained largely unchanged. Mars, like Ares, was the god of war, embodying the destructive and primal force of battle. But his role in Roman society also carried deeper connotations related to military prowess, honor, and the protection of the Roman state. The legacy of Ares in Roman mythology is a fascinating study of how ancient cultures adapted and reinterpreted their gods, molding them to reflect the unique values and ideals of their respective societies. Mars was one of the most important and revered gods in Roman religion, and his worship was deeply tied to the identity of Rome itself. Unlike Ares, who was often portrayed as a somewhat chaotic and unpredictable figure in Greek mythology, Mars took on a more structured and disciplined role in Roman mythology. While Ares represented the brutality and violence of war, Mars was associated not only with the destruction of enemies, but also with the glory and honor that came from victorious combat. For the Romans, war was not just a necessity, but a defining aspect of their civilization. Mars, as their god of war, was central to their identity and aspirations. Mars was also seen as a protector of Rome. He was not merely a god who thrived in the chaos of battle. He was a figure who represented the strength and security of the Roman state. As the god who ensured the survival and expansion of Rome, Mars was a symbol of Roman military might and discipline. His worship was an expression of the Roman people's belief in their destiny as conquerors, a belief that was rooted in their martial culture and their connection to the divine. The Romans believed that their success in battle was directly linked to Mars's favor, and his protection was sought before embarking on military campaigns. The significance of Mars in Roman society is further emphasized by the fact that he was one of the few gods who had a prominent role in both Roman warfare and Roman politics. Mars was deeply intertwined with the Roman ideals of duty, service, and honor. His connection to the military was not just about the physical act of fighting, but about the broader sense of duty to the state and the preservation of Roman values. The Roman military was the backbone of the empire, and Mars was considered its divine patron. His favor was sought by generals before battles, and his blessings were believed to be crucial for the success of the Roman legions. The idea of martial discipline and the valor of Roman soldiers was deeply tied to Mars, whose presence in Roman life served as a constant reminder of the importance of war in the empire's growth and stability. In Roman myth, Mars was also linked to the founding of Rome. According to the myth of Romulus and Remus, the twin brothers who were said to be the legendary founders of Rome, Mars was their divine father. This connection to Mars gave Romulus and Remus, and by extension the city of Rome, a divine legitimacy and divine protection. The myth emphasized that Rome's greatness was not just a product of human effort, but was also the result of divine favor. Mars, as the father of Romulus, symbolized the martial spirit that would define Rome's rise to power. The very foundation of Rome was seen as being tied to the god of war, reinforcing the idea that Rome was destined for greatness through military conquest. The relationship between Mars and Rome is also reflected in the festivals and rituals dedicated to him. One of the most significant festivals in Mars's honor was the Feriae Martii, held annually in March, which was a month named after him. The festival was a time for the Romans to celebrate their military victories and honor their god. It was a time of purification and renewal for the Roman army, where soldiers and commanders alike would offer sacrifices to Mars in the hopes of receiving his blessings for future campaigns. The festival also symbolized the connection between the Roman military and the divine, emphasizing the role that Mars played in ensuring Rome's military success and, by extension, its continued dominance. In addition to the Feriae Martii, Mars was also honored with the agricultural festival of Mars, a festival that highlighted his dual role as not only the god of war, but also as a god of agriculture and fertility. In Roman mythology, Mars was seen as a protector of crops and a guardian of the land. This aspect of his character reflected the Roman belief that war and agriculture were intrinsically linked. Rome's military might allowed for the expansion of its territories, which in turn supported its agricultural economy. Mars, in this sense, was not just a destroyer, but also a provider, a god who ensured the prosperity of Rome through both conquest and fertility. Mars's role as a protector and nurturer of Rome also extended to the Campus Martius, the Field of Mars, a large public space in the heart of Rome where soldiers trained, and where important military decisions were made. The Campo Marzio was dedicated to Mars as a reminder of the god's oversight of both the physical and spiritual aspects of Roman warfare. It was also a place of political and religious significance, where leaders would come together to honor Mars and seek his guidance in matters of war. The field of Mars embodied the connection between the military, the divine, and the political, reflecting the all-encompassing role that Mars played in the Roman way of life. While Mars was primarily known as the god of war, his influence in Roman mythology extended beyond the battlefield. He was also associated with protection, victory, and leadership. Mars represented not just the violence and destruction of conflict, but also the strength, honor, and discipline that could emerge from it. In this sense, Mars had a more nuanced role in Roman society than Ares did in Greek mythology. While Ares was often seen as a god of chaotic destruction, Mars was a god who was revered for his ability to bring both destruction and order, chaos and discipline, victory and protection. In the larger context of Roman mythology, Mars was one of the key figures who embodied the ideals that the Romans valued most: strength, courage, honor, and military prowess. His legacy as the protector of the Roman state and the divine father of the legendary founder of Rome, Romulus, was a crucial part of the Roman identity. Mars, as a god, represented both the power of the sword and the responsibility that came with wielding it. Through his worship, the Romans sought not only victory in battle, but also divine guidance and protection for the empire that was built upon military conquest. Ares, the ancient Greek god of war, has left a lasting mark not only on the ancient world, but also on modern culture. Though his worship has faded over time, his influence persists in art, literature, and even popular media. The enduring legacy of Ares as the personification of violence, conflict, and aggression continues to shape how we understand and depict the concept of war. This impact can be seen in everything from the portrayal of military figures in literature and film to the symbolic use of Ares in modern political and cultural contexts. The most immediate and obvious legacy of Ares can be found in the continued reverence for war gods in modern popular culture. In the Western world, Ares' Roman counterpart, Mars, continues to be a symbol of military strength and conquest. The image of Mars as the god of war is still invoked in modern times to represent military might and national power. For instance, many national armies and military forces around the world have used Mars, or Ares, as a symbol of strength, power, and aggression. The iconic figure of a warrior god, often portrayed with weapons in hand and armored for battle, serves as a visual shorthand for the martial ideals of courage, discipline, and honor. In popular culture, Ares has made numerous appearances, particularly in the genre of superhero comics, movies, and television shows. Perhaps most notably, Ares is a major character in DC Comics, where he appears as a powerful antagonist to the superhero Wonder Woman. In the Wonder Woman comics and films, Ares is depicted as a god who embodies the darker side of war, its brutality, chaos, and destruction. In these modern interpretations, Ares remains a god who revels in the violence of conflict, seeking to spread war across the world. His presence in the comics serves as a reminder that the destructive aspects of war are as much a part of our modern understanding of conflict as they were in ancient mythology. Ares' portrayal in Wonder Woman is not unique. The god of war often appears as a symbol of the darker aspects of human nature in films, literature, and television. Whether as an antagonist or as a symbol of destruction, Ares is consistently associated with the chaos and violence that come with war. His character is used to explore the moral complexities of conflict, how war can bring both glory and ruin, how it can lead to both heroism and villainy. Through the lens of Ares, modern audiences are confronted with the multifaceted nature of war, where the line between good and evil can often become blurred. Beyond the realm of comics and film, Ares also makes an appearance in the visual arts. Artists throughout history have drawn on the imagery of Ares to symbolize war and its effects. From ancient Greek pottery to Renaissance paintings, Ares is depicted as a warrior god in full armor, often holding a spear or shield. These images evoke the timeless association between war and the divine, reinforcing the idea that war, for better or worse, has always been a part of the human experience. Ares, as an artistic figure, becomes a symbol of the eternal conflict that defines much of human history. Ares' legacy also extends to the world of literature. In both ancient and modern texts, Ares is a central figure in discussions about the nature of war and violence. Ancient Greek playwrights and poets often explored the themes of war and its effects, with Ares serving as a metaphor for the destructive power of conflict. In modern literature, authors continue to use Ares as a symbol for the horrors and consequences of war. His character is often invoked in works that deal with themes of military conflict, heroism, and sacrifice, as well as the psychological toll that war takes on both soldiers and civilians. In addition to his direct influence on art and media, Ares has also left a legacy in the political realm. War and conflict are central to the functioning of many nations, and the figure of Ares has been invoked by politicians and leaders to justify military action or to rally support for war. His image has been used as a symbol of national pride and strength, particularly in times of conflict. The god of war, in this context, serves as a reminder of the necessity of violence and aggression in the defense of one's nation or people. Despite the many ways Ares has been used to symbolize military power, his image is also associated with the more destructive and negative aspects of war. In the modern era, Ares' figure has often been used to criticize the glorification of violence and the toll that war takes on human life. As war continues to be a prominent part of modern life, particularly in the context of political struggles and international conflicts, Ares is often invoked as a symbol of the senselessness and brutality of war. His image, as a god who thrives on destruction, is a powerful tool for exploring the moral and ethical implications of war in the modern world. Ares' influence also extends to discussions of gender and masculinity in modern culture. As the god who represents physical strength, aggression, and dominance, Ares is often associated with traditional ideals of masculinity. His image has been used to explore the ways in which war and violence intersect with concepts of gender, particularly the portrayal of men as warriors. This exploration of Ares' character in modern contexts often seeks to challenge or critique these traditional ideals, asking whether the glorification of war and aggression is truly in line with the values of contemporary society. In the realm of philosophy and psychology, Ares continues to play a role as a symbol of human nature's capacity for violence and aggression. Philosophers and theorists have used Ares as a figure to explore the duality of human nature, the capacity for both good and evil, the impulse to protect and to destroy. In the modern era, Ares represents the tension between the desire for peace and the inevitability of war. He is a reminder that, as long as human societies exist, the potential for conflict will always be present, and the power of Ares will always resonate within the darker corners of the human psyche. Ares' continued relevance in modern culture is a testament to the enduring power of myth. Even as societies evolve and change, the figures from ancient mythology continue to offer insight into the complexities of human nature. Ares, as the god of war, symbolizes the eternal struggle between violence and peace, destruction and creation, chaos and order. In this sense, Ares is as relevant today as he was in ancient Greece, providing a lens through which we can explore the timeless and universal themes of conflict, power, and human struggle. In Greek mythology, the gods were often portrayed as immortal, immune to death in the way that mortals understood it. However, while they were not bound by the same limitations of time and mortality, the gods were still capable of suffering, being wounded, or facing defeat. Ares, the god of war, is no exception to this rule. While he never truly dies in the traditional sense, his mythological journey includes moments where he is brought to the brink of destruction, symbolizing his vulnerability despite his immense power. These moments serve as a reminder that even the mightiest of gods, including Ares, are subject to the forces of fate, conflict, and divine will. Ares' mythological death, or at least his near-death experiences, are most prominently featured in the context of his role in the Trojan War, where his reckless involvement in battle leads to his injuries and temporary incapacitation. These moments where Ares is wounded or captured are vital in understanding the complexity of his character. He is not invincible or invulnerable, but rather a god who, like mortals, faces the risks and consequences of war. The most notable instance of Ares' vulnerability occurs in the Iliad, the epic poem by Homer that recounts the events of the Trojan War. In Book 5, Ares is depicted as a powerful and formidable presence on the battlefield. As the embodiment of war itself, he fights for the Trojans and joins in the fray with great fervor. However, Ares' recklessness and unchecked aggression, hallmarks of his character, ultimately lead to his downfall in the hands of Diomedes, a hero of the Greek forces. Diomedes, with the help of the goddess Athena, strikes Ares with a spear during a heated battle. This injury is significant because it marks one of the rare moments in the Iliad where a god is physically wounded. Ares is forced to retreat, his immense strength temporarily rendered useless by the mortal hero. This wound is symbolic of Ares' vulnerability, as it serves as a reminder that even gods, particularly those who embody violent forces like Ares, can be hurt in the chaos of war. Despite his divine nature and immense power, Ares is not immune to the consequences of his actions on the battlefield. Ares' retreat from battle is not just a physical act, but a moment of humiliation. The god of war, typically associated with domination and invulnerability, is forced to withdraw in the face of a mortal hero. His pride is wounded, and he complains to his father, Zeus, about the injustice of being struck down by a mortal. Zeus, though sympathetic, does not intervene. Instead, he allows Ares to suffer the consequences of his rash behavior, reinforcing the idea that even gods must face the realities of the violent forces they embody. This moment in the Iliad serves as a profound commentary on Ares' role in the world of the gods. While he is undeniably powerful, his power is not without limits. His character is defined by his unpredictability, his reckless nature, and his eagerness to embrace the chaos of battle. But these traits also make him vulnerable. Ares' vulnerability highlights the inherent dangers of the forces of war. While they can bring glory and victory, they can also lead to suffering and defeat. Ares' death, in this sense, is symbolic. He does not die in the way that mortals do, nor is he permanently defeated. However, his temporary incapacitation by a mortal hero highlights the fragility of even the most powerful of beings when caught in the unpredictable tides of war. His eventual recovery and return to the battlefield after his injury remind us that while Ares, like other gods, may suffer setbacks, his nature as the god of war cannot be entirely subdued. He is a force that, like war itself, cannot be fully controlled or extinguished. In the mythological context, Ares' experiences with wounding and near death are also deeply intertwined with his father Zeus's role as the king of the gods. In many stories, Zeus stands as a figure of authority who must oversee the consequences of war, both the battles fought among mortals and the divine conflicts that arise among the gods. Ares' vulnerability in the Iliad underscores Zeus's role as the ultimate authority in the divine order. While Zeus is not always directly involved in battle, his decisions shape the fate of the gods and their participation in mortal affairs. In one of the more poignant moments of Ares' near-death experience, Zeus tells him that the gods must accept the reality of war, both its victories and its losses. Ares' wound is not merely a physical injury, but a symbol of the cost of war, a reminder that even the gods are not immune to the suffering that conflict brings. This moment emphasizes the harshness of Ares' existence. While he is the embodiment of war, he is also subject to the pain and consequences that come with it. Although Ares is not physically killed, the theme of death and destruction looms large in his myth. He is the god who revels in the violence and bloodshed of battle, yet his own nature exposes him to the possibility of destruction. The paradox of Ares is that he embodies the very force of violence and conflict that can destroy not only others, but himself as well. His near-death experiences serve as a powerful reminder that even gods of war are not invincible. Death, destruction, and suffering are forces that even they must face. The mythological death of Ares also speaks to the cyclical nature of war. In Greek mythology, death and rebirth are recurring themes, particularly in the context of war. Ares, as the god who represents this cycle of violence, is not exempt from its consequences. His injury and recovery, his momentary withdrawal from battle, are part of the larger narrative of conflict. War never truly ends, and even the mightiest of gods are swept up in its endless cycle. The story of Ares' near-death is not just about his personal vulnerability, but about the larger forces of war that shape the lives of gods and mortals alike. While Ares does not die in the way that mortals do, his near-death experiences are central to understanding his character. They illustrate the limits of his power, the complexities of his existence, and the tragic nature of his role as the god of war. Ares is both a symbol of strength and vulnerability, a force that both creates and destroys. His mythological death, symbolized by his wound and retreat from battle, is a reminder that war, though a divine force, is also a force that brings suffering and loss, even to the gods who embody it. Ares, the god of war, has transcended his ancient Greek origins to become a potent symbol in modern culture, representing not only the brutal force of conflict, but also the complex interplay of human nature, power, and violence. Although his worship in the ancient world has faded, Ares' legacy lives on in various aspects of contemporary life, from literature and media to political and social discourse. His symbolism as the embodiment of war and aggression has been adapted and reinterpreted in ways that reflect both the lasting fascination with his character and the evolution of how we view conflict. In the modern world, Ares is often invoked as a figure who embodies the darker aspects of war, the violence, chaos, and destruction that accompany human conflict. Yet, at the same time, he also represents the drive, determination, and sometimes even the necessity of battle. As societies continue to grapple with the realities of war and peace, Ares remains a relevant symbol, offering insight into both the human desire for power and the inevitable consequences of violence. One of the most significant ways in which Ares is invoked in the modern world is through his representation in popular media. From comic books and video games to films and television series, Ares is frequently depicted as a central figure in stories that deal with conflict, power, and the nature of war. In DC Comics, Ares is a recurring character, often portrayed as the antagonist of Wonder Woman, where he embodies the destructive and chaotic forces of war. In these modern interpretations, Ares is not just a god who revels in violence, but a figure whose presence threatens the balance between peace and destruction. He is the embodiment of the human impulse toward conflict, representing not just external battles, but the internal struggles that come with war and aggression. Ares' depiction in Wonder Woman, both in comics and in films, offers a more nuanced view of the god. While he is undeniably a force of destruction, Ares is also a tragic figure, representing the inevitable nature of war and the suffering that it causes. His character in these stories is not simply that of an antagonist. Rather, he is a reflection of the darker side of human nature, one that is often pushed to the forefront in times of war. Ares, in this context, becomes a symbol not just of power, but of the cost of conflict, both for the individuals who fight and for the societies that wage war. Beyond superhero comics, Ares continues to make his mark in various forms of storytelling. In literature, Ares often symbolizes the primal urge for dominance and the destructive forces that come with it. He represents not just the physical violence of war, but the psychological and emotional toll that war takes on those who participate in it. In modern novels, particularly those that deal with military conflict, Ares is sometimes invoked as a metaphor for the internal struggles faced by soldiers, leaders, and civilians caught in the throes of war. His character, though rooted in ancient mythology, speaks to the timeless nature of human violence and the universal experience of war. Ares also holds a significant place in the realm of video games. As the god of war, he is often depicted as a central figure in titles that center on combat and conflict. In games like God of War, Ares is not only a character to be defeated, but also a symbol of the destructive nature of unchecked power. His role in such games reflects the modern fascination with both the heroism and the horror that war brings. In these digital worlds, Ares' power is often a double-edged sword, representing both the strength to overcome obstacles and the destructive potential that comes with wielding such immense power. Video games, as interactive narratives, allow players to explore these themes more directly, with Ares acting as both a villain and a warning about the dangers of war. Ares' symbolism has also found a place in the political discourse of the modern world. War, as a tool of policy and diplomacy, continues to be a central issue in global politics, and Ares is often invoked in discussions about the morality and necessity of military intervention. His image, as the god who embodies both the glory and the destruction of war, serves as a reminder of the consequences of armed conflict. In speeches, political rhetoric, and even protest movements, Ares is sometimes used as a symbol of the inevitable and uncontrollable nature of war, a force that, once unleashed, consumes everything in its path. The god of war becomes a metaphor for the way in which nations and leaders may be driven to violence, often with unforeseen and far-reaching consequences. The modern use of Ares as a symbol also extends to discussions about the military-industrial complex and the militarization of society. In a world where war and conflict are sometimes normalized as part of international relations and national security, Ares' presence as a symbol of power and violence offers a critique of the structures that perpetuate war. His image in this context is used to question the glorification of military might and the consequences of the human obsession with conflict. Ares, as a symbol of war, becomes a reminder of the potential cost of building a society that prioritizes power and aggression over peace and diplomacy. Despite his association with the darker aspects of war, Ares also represents the warrior spirit and the strength that comes from resilience and determination. This duality of Ares, his embodiment of both the destruction and the honor of war, has made him a complex and enduring symbol in modern culture. While Ares is often depicted as a figure of aggression, his role as the god who leads warriors to battle also reflects the nobility and courage that can arise from combat. In this light, Ares serves as a reminder that war is not just a force of devastation, but can also be a source of personal and collective identity, especially for those who believe that victory on the battlefield defines them. The continued relevance of Ares in modern culture speaks to the timeless nature of his mythological symbolism. War, though it may take different forms today, is still an essential part of human history and experience. Ares, as the personification of war, represents both the allure and the horror of conflict, its capacity to both empower and destroy. His legacy, as a figure who embodies the primal instincts of war, is as relevant today as it was in the ancient world. Through his presence in literature, media, politics, and even the discussions surrounding military power, Ares continues to remind us of the complex and often tragic relationship between human beings and the violence that comes with war. Ares, the god of war, is often seen as a symbol of raw aggression and destruction, the embodiment of conflict itself. However, in examining the ancient myths surrounding him, one cannot overlook the complex relationship between Ares and the concept of honor in war. War, in the ancient Greek world, was not simply about violence. It was also deeply intertwined with ideas of nobility, personal glory, and societal duty. As the god who governed the chaos of battle, Ares played a role not only in the devastation of war, but also in the cultivation of the honor that warriors sought through their acts of combat. In Greek mythology, the concept of honor was integral to the identity of a warrior. Heroes like Achilles, Hector, and Odysseus were defined not just by their skill in battle, but by their pursuit of personal and communal honor. For the Greeks, Honor in war was about more than winning battles. It was about achieving greatness, maintaining one's reputation, and upholding the values of bravery and sacrifice. In this context, Ares was seen as the god who could either bestow or take away the potential for such honor. Ares' relationship with honor in war is often seen in contrast to that of Athena, the goddess of wisdom and strategy, who represents a more measured and disciplined approach to battle. While Athena guided warriors to victory through intellect and cunning, Ares embodied the chaotic and violent aspects of war, where honor was achieved not through strategy or control, but through direct confrontation and the willingness to engage in the brutal realities of battle. Ares' presence in Greek mythology speaks to the dual nature of war, its capacity for both noble acts and horrifying destruction, and to the fact that honor in war was not always tied to moral righteousness, but to the ability to fight and survive within the brutal system of violence that war often represented. Ares' association with honor in war is evident in his role during the Trojan War. Both the Greeks and the Trojans revered Ares in different ways, with each side seeking his favor before battle. His power was viewed as essential for warriors who sought victory and glory. Yet, his influence was not always consistent or predictable. Ares was as likely to inspire terror in those who fought as he was to guide them toward honorable victory. His support was not unconditional. Warriors had to prove themselves worthy in his eyes, and only through their strength and willingness to embrace the chaos of combat could they achieve the kind of honor Ares represented. In many myths, Ares' influence on the battlefield is depicted in a more ambivalent light. Ares was not simply a god who granted victory, he was also a force that could bring about defeat and suffering. The Trojan War, in particular, showcases Ares' dual nature. While he fought on the side of the Trojans, lending them his strength and power, his presence did not guarantee their success. Ares' participation in the war is marked by his reckless nature, his willingness to engage in the chaos without concern for the consequences. For the Trojans, Ares was a figure who could offer them power, but he was also a god whose aggression could easily lead to disaster. One of the most significant moments that illustrates Ares' role in the concept of honor in war occurs when Ares faces off against the Greek hero Diomedes. During a battle in the Iliad, Diomedes, with the help of the goddess Athena, wounds Ares, forcing the god of war to retreat from the battlefield. This moment is pivotal because it marks one of the rare instances in which a mortal hero bests a god in direct combat. The wound that Ares receives is not just a physical injury, it is a symbolic moment of dishonor for the god. Ares, who represents the power and fury of war, is humbled by a mortal warrior, revealing the precarious nature of honor in the chaotic world of battle. In this scene, Ares is deeply upset by his defeat. He complains to his father Zeus about the injustice of being struck down by a mortal, and his sense of dishonor is palpable. This moment serves as a reminder that even gods like Ares are not immune to the concepts of pride and personal glory. The god of war is not just a mindless force of destruction. He is a figure who feels the sting of defeat and humiliation, and his sense of honor is as fragile as that of the mortal warriors who fight in his name. Ares' vulnerability in this moment underscores the complexity of his character. He is a god who thrives on chaos and aggression, but he is also deeply tied to the human experience of honor and pride. Ares' response to this defeat, also speaks to the Greek understanding of honor in battle. In the Greek world, the warrior ethos was intimately tied to the idea of personal honor. Heroes sought to achieve great feats in battle, not just for the sake of victory, but to enhance their own reputations and earn eternal glory. For Ares, this concept of personal honor was equally important. His pride as the god of war was wounded by his defeat at the hands of a mortal, and his retreat from the battlefield was an acknowledgement that honor, even in the divine realm, was not guaranteed. The intersection of Ares and honor in war is also explored through the actions of the greatest Greek heroes. Characters like Achilles and Hector are driven by a desire for honor and glory in battle. Their personal quests for honor are often framed within the larger context of war, where victory on the battlefield can lead to eternal fame, but also to the inevitable consequences of war's violence. Ares, as the embodiment of conflict, is a god whose presence on the battlefield heightens the stakes of honor and glory. In the Iliad, the warrior's pursuit of honor is not just about fighting for a cause, but about fighting for recognition, to be remembered for their bravery and strength. Yet, Ares' role in honor is also tinged with the awareness of the futility of war. While the Greek heroes fight for glory, Ares, as the god of war, represents the darker side of this pursuit, the suffering and destruction that come with the relentless cycle of battle. Ares is both the symbol of martial glory and a reminder of the violence that can arise from a desire for personal honor. His actions on the battlefield are not driven by moral considerations, but by the forces of chaos and destruction that underpin the nature of war. In this way, Ares serves as a critique of the pursuit of honor through violence, a warning that the cost of glory in war is often much greater than any hero can anticipate. In modern interpretations of Ares, the god continues to embody both the glory and the tragedy of war. His role as the god of war is frequently explored in literature, film, and media, where his character represents the internal conflict of those who seek honor through violence. Whether depicted as an antagonist or as a symbol of destructive power, Ares serves as a reminder that war, even in its pursuit of glory, often leads to suffering and dishonor. The modern symbolism of Ares emphasizes the duality of honor in war. The pursuit of personal glory can be noble, but it is often entwined with the devastating consequences of conflict. In this way, Ares' legacy as the god of war and honor continues to shape modern understandings of conflict. His presence in contemporary media, political discourse, and cultural discussions about war and violence underscores the enduring relevance of the themes of honor, pride, and destruction that he embodies. Ares, as a symbol, represents not just the power and allure of battle, but also the cost of that power. The lives lost, the families torn apart, and the emotional toll of the pursuit of honor in war. Ares, the god of war, is not only a figure of physical destruction, but also one that embodies the psychological toll of conflict. While Greek mythology often focuses on the visceral aspects of war, its battles, bloodshed, and victories, Ares, as the god who personifies war itself, also represents the psychological anguish that follows in its wake. The impact of war on the mind and spirit of those involved is a theme that runs deeply through the myths surrounding Ares, especially as they relate to the ancient warriors and heroes who fought in his name. War, in both ancient and modern contexts, is rarely just a physical battle. It is also a psychological struggle where the minds of the warriors, leaders, and civilians are tested by fear, grief, and the brutal realities of conflict. Ares, as the embodiment of war, is a figure who encapsulates both the external violence of battle and the internal turmoil that follows. The warriors who fought in his name were not just grappling with physical wounds. They were often facing emotional scars that could last a lifetime. In the Iliad, Homer provides a vivid portrayal of the psychological effects of war on the characters, particularly the Greek and Trojan heroes. Ares, as the central god of battle, is closely tied to these warriors and their experiences. One of the most poignant aspects of these depictions is the emotional toll that war takes on even the mightiest of warriors. Heroes like Achilles and Hector are driven by a desire for honor, glory, and the protection of their people. But the cost of this pursuit is often profound. Ares, as the god who oversees the violence of war, reflects the ways in which warriors are not only physically transformed by combat, but psychologically scarred as well. Ares' presence in the Iliad and other ancient texts speaks to the dual nature of his influence. He is both a symbol of the glory and honor that can come from battle, but also a reminder of the devastating emotional costs of war. Ares does not simply represent the chaos of conflict. He represents the emotional and mental havoc it wreaks on those who engage in it. In many ways, Ares' role in these myths is to highlight the contradiction of war. It can elevate warriors to legendary status, but it can also break them psychologically, leaving them vulnerable to fear, doubt, and despair. One of the most powerful depictions of the psychological impact of war is seen in the character of Achilles. Achilles, the greatest of the Greek warriors, is driven by a desire for glory and immortality through his deeds on the battlefield. However, the war takes a heavy toll on him, not only physically, but emotionally. In the Iliad, Achilles withdraws from battle after his close friend Patroclus is killed by Hector. This moment is not just an expression of rage or grief. It is a sign of the deep emotional and psychological trauma that war causes. Achilles, who had once reveled in the violence of battle, is overwhelmed by the loss of his friend, and his withdrawal from the conflict reflects the internal struggle that he faces. His decision to return to the fight later is driven not by a desire for victory, but by a need to avenge his friend and restore his sense of honor. The psychological weight of his grief is as significant as the physical wounds he suffers, underscoring the mental scars that war leaves behind. Ares, as the god of war, also represents the trauma that can follow the end of battle. While warriors may find glory on the battlefield, they also face the emotional burden of the lives they have taken and the destruction they have witnessed. The gods themselves are not immune to this psychological impact. In the Iliad, we see the gods themselves grappling with the consequences of war. Even Zeus, the king of the gods, is depicted as weary of the endless cycle of conflict. He acknowledges the cost of war, both for mortals and for the divine, and his weariness reflects the broader theme of the psychological burden that war imposes on all involved. This weariness is a reflection of Ares' influence. War is not just a physical experience. It is a psychological and emotional trial that affects everyone, even the gods. Ares' connection to the psychological impact of war is also seen in the figure of Hector, the Trojan hero. Hector is depicted as a noble warrior who fights to protect his family and his city. However, as the war progresses, Hector's internal conflict becomes more pronounced. He is fully aware of the dangers of war, and yet he is compelled to continue fighting, knowing that his death is inevitable. Hector's eventual death at the hands of Achilles is not just a physical defeat. It is the culmination of his psychological journey throughout the war. The pressure of battle, the weight of responsibility, and the fear of losing his honor all contribute to his internal turmoil. Hector, like many warriors, is driven by a sense of duty and love for his family, but he is also deeply affected by the emotional and psychological toll of the war. Ares, as the god who embodies this struggle, is present in Hector's journey, serving as a reminder of the emotional burdens that accompany the pursuit of glory and honor in battle. The psychological effects of war also extend to the soldiers who fight in Ares' name, but are not necessarily the heroes of the mythological narrative. In many ways, Ares' influence is most evident in the unnamed warriors who engage in battle, fighting not for fame or immortality, but simply to survive. These soldiers are the faceless masses who make up the bulk of any army, and their psychological experience of war is often one of fear, anxiety, and trauma. In the Iliad, the warriors are often depicted as feeling the weight of their mortality as they face the horrors of battle. They are fully aware that the gods may intervene to determine the outcome, but they are also confronted with the reality of death on the battlefield. Ares' power in this context is not just about the physical violence of combat, but about the constant anxiety and fear that grip the warriors as they face the uncertainty of war. In modern contexts, Ares continues to symbolize the psychological impact of war, particularly in the representation of soldiers and veterans in literature, film, and media. The psychological effects of war, including post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, have become central themes in contemporary discussions about military conflict. Ares' mythological influence can be seen in the portrayal of soldiers who, after returning from battle, struggle to cope with the trauma they have experienced. His role as a symbol of war's destructive power is reinterpreted in modern times as a reminder that the effects of conflict extend far beyond the battlefield, shaping the lives of those who survive it for years to come. In conclusion, Ares, as the god of war, represents not only the external violence of conflict, but also the psychological toll that war takes on those involved. Through the myths and stories surrounding Ares, we are reminded that war is not just a physical event. It is a deeply emotional and psychological experience that affects both gods and mortals alike. Ares' presence in these stories serves as a powerful metaphor for the internal struggle that warriors face as they navigate the horrors of battle. And his legacy continues to influence modern portrayals of the psychological consequences of war. Whether in ancient texts or contemporary media, Ares remains a symbol of the complex relationship between conflict, honor, and the human psyche. Ares, the god of war, is one of the most complex and paradoxical figures in Greek mythology. He represents the violence, chaos, and destruction inherent in war, yet his role is not merely one of mindless aggression. In examining the myths surrounding Ares, it becomes clear that he embodies the duality of war itself, the glory and honor that warriors seek, alongside the pain, suffering, and devastation that inevitably accompany conflict. This duality in Ares' nature makes him an enduring symbol of both the positive and negative aspects of war, illustrating how conflict can simultaneously be a force of both creation and destruction. Ares' association with the violence and chaos of war is well documented in Greek mythology. He is often portrayed as a fierce and relentless god, reveling in the bloodshed of battle. His power is derived from the sheer force and intensity of war, and his influence is most evident on the battlefield, where he inspires soldiers to fight with unyielding aggression. However, Ares' role is not just one of violence. He is also a figure of personal honor and glory, particularly in the context of the warriors who fought in his name. His influence can be seen in the heroic figures of ancient Greece, who sought to achieve immortality through their deeds in battle. The duality of Ares as both a god of destruction and a symbol of honor in battle is best exemplified in the Trojan War, one of the most significant conflicts in Greek mythology. Ares' involvement in the war reflects the tension between the noble pursuit of glory and the inevitable suffering that war brings. On one hand, Ares fights to support the Trojans, providing them with the strength and power to challenge the Greek forces. On the other hand, Ares' presence is a reminder of the destructive nature of the war, and his participation underscores the chaos that war inevitably brings. Even as Ares aids his chosen side, he cannot escape the destructive consequences of the conflict. In the Iliad, Ares' role as a god of war is tied to the idea of personal glory. Greek warriors, such as Hector and Achilles, fought not just for survival, but for the honor and glory that came with victory. For these heroes, war was not simply a means to an end. It was a path to immortality. Their actions on the battlefield, driven by their desire to achieve personal renown, reflect Ares' influence as the god who rewards valor and strength. Yet, while these warriors seek glory, they are also caught in the destructive cycle of war, where each victory comes with its own cost. The honor they achieve is often overshadowed by the bloodshed, loss, and personal sacrifice that war demands. Ares, as the god of war, represents both the promise of glory and the inevitable consequences of violence. Ares' dual nature is further illustrated by his interactions with other gods. While Ares embodies the violent aspects of war, gods like Athena represent the more strategic and calculated side of conflict. Athena, the goddess of wisdom, is often shown guiding warriors with strategy, leading them toward victory through intellect and foresight. Ares, by contrast, fights with raw aggression and impulsiveness, leading his followers into battle without the careful planning that Athena espouses. The tension between Ares and Athena reflects the broader themes of Greek mythology, where war is not a simple matter of strength, but a complex interplay of intellect, strategy, and force. The fact that Ares and Athena are both necessary figures on the battlefield speaks to the multifaceted nature of war, where destruction and glory are inseparable. While Ares represents the destructive aspects of war, his mythological stories also acknowledge the honor that warriors seek through combat. In ancient Greek society, warriors were not simply defined by their strength, but by their courage and willingness to fight for their city, family, or honor. Ares, as the god who inspires warriors to achieve greatness, embodies the ideal of martial excellence. His presence in the myths serves as a reminder that war, though brutal, is also an arena where personal heroism can be expressed. This aspect of Ares is particularly evident in the heroic figures of the Iliad, such as Achilles, who seeks honor above all else, even at the cost of his life. Ares, in this sense, represents the nobility and glory that warriors associate with combat, a factor that makes war both desirable and tragic. Yet, the duality of Ares becomes most apparent in his relationship with the psychological effects of war. While warriors may seek glory and honor, the realities of battle are far more complex. War is not just a place of heroism and victory. It is a place of fear, grief, and loss. Ares, as the god of war, embodies both the glory of battle and the trauma it causes. His myths are filled with images of warriors who are driven to madness by the horrors of combat. Ares is not merely a figure of strength and power. He is also a symbol of the psychological toll that war takes on the minds of those who fight. The heroes who seek his favor are not only confronted with physical dangers, but also the internal conflict of facing the consequences of their actions on the battlefield. The warriors in Ares's myths are often depicted as grappling with the psychological effects of war. In the Iliad, Achilles' grief over the death of his friend Patroclus and Hector's internal struggle as he faces his inevitable death illustrate the emotional turmoil that accompanies battle. Ares, as the god who presides over war, is a reflection of this psychological aspect of conflict. His presence is a reminder that war is not just about fighting for honor or survival. It is about the emotional and mental challenges that arise from taking part in violent conflict. Ares, in this way, is a symbol of the internal struggle that warriors face, where the pursuit of glory is often overshadowed by the toll that war takes on their minds and spirits. The modern interpretation of Ares continues to reflect this duality. In contemporary discussions about war and conflict, Ares is often invoked as a symbol of both the destructive power of war and the human desire for honor and glory. His legacy can be seen in the portrayal of soldiers and warriors in literature, film, and popular media, where their quests for victory are often complicated by the psychological and emotional scars of war. Ares' influence in these modern depictions speaks to the ongoing relevance of the duality of war, how it can be both a source of personal heroism and a cause of profound psychological suffering. In political discourse, Ares is sometimes used to symbolize the destructive nature of war, particularly in discussions about the morality of military conflict. While Ares' influence can still be seen in the glorification of military power, his legacy also serves as a critique of the glorification of violence. His role as the god of war highlights the tension between the human desire for strength and victory, and the inevitable consequences of those pursuits. Ares, as a figure of both destruction and glory, is a reminder that war, while capable of bringing honor, also brings suffering, loss, and devastation. Ultimately, Ares' legacy as the god of war reflects the dual nature of conflict itself. War is not just about destruction. It is also about the pursuit of honor, glory, and the human desire to overcome adversity. Ares embodies both the nobility and the tragedy of battle, representing the desire for personal and collective glory, while also reminding us of the devastating consequences that war brings. His duality makes him a complex and enduring symbol in both ancient and modern times, serving as a reminder that the forces of war, though capable of bringing both honor and destruction, are never without their cost. As we reach the end of our exploration into the mythological journey of Ares, the god of war, we can reflect on the complexity of his character and the profound impact he has had on both ancient and modern societies. Ares, as the embodiment of war, symbolizes not only the brutal, destructive force of conflict, but also the honor, pride and personal glory that can arise from it. His legacy transcends the ancient world, remaining a relevant figure in literature, media, and discussions about the nature of war and violence. Ares' influence on the heroes of Greek mythology, his role in the Trojan War, and his impact on the psyche of warriors remind us that war is never one-dimensional. It is a force that can both build and destroy, inspire greatness and inflict suffering. Through the lens of Ares, we can understand the duality of conflict, the way it shapes both the external world and the inner world of those who participate in it. In the end, Ares teaches us that war is not only about the battles we fight, but about the costs we bear, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. His presence in mythology continues to remind us of the eternal nature of conflict and the complicated legacy it leaves behind. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the life and legacy of Ares, the god of war. If you've enjoyed this exploration of myth, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. Your engagement helps us continue delving into the fascinating world of mythology and history. Until next time, may you find strength in both the glory and the lessons of the past.